The summer sun beat down mercilessly on Dust Creek, Texas, as Eleanor Briggs stood in the dirt with her wrists bound, listening to a man auction her life for grain. In 1875, desperation turned humans into commodities, and she was next. But when a tall cowboy stepped forward with eyes like steel and a voice steady as stone, everything changed. This is the story of how one man's conscience rewrote two destinies. Stay until the end and comment what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The drought had been merciless that summer, the kind that stripped the land bare and exposed the raw bones of human nature beneath the veneer of civilization. In the small town of Dust Creek, Texas, located in the northern reaches of the state where the prairie met the edge of desperation, the year 1875 would be remembered not for rain or harvest, but for the day a woman was put up for sale in broad daylight, and the day a cowboy decided that some lines should never be crossed, no matter how hungry a man might be. Eleanor Briggs had not imagined her life would come to this moment. 20 years old, copper-haired, with eyes the color of creek water in spring, back when creeks still had water, she stood in the dusty street outside Harmon's general store with her wrists tied together with rough hemp rope. The fibers bit into her skin, leaving angry red marks that would fade in time, though the memory of this day never would. Her blue calico dress, once pristine and carefully pressed, now hung limp against her frame, darkened with dust and sweat, clinging to her thin shoulders like a shroud. The sun hammered down from a sky bleached white with heat, the kind of oppressive, suffocating warmth that made it hard to draw breath, that made every movement feel like wading through molasses. Around her the town had gathered, not everyone, but enough. Enough to bear witness, enough to make her humiliation complete. Thomas Dunley, the man who called himself her guardian, though he had no legal right to the title, stood beside her like a carnival barker, his voice carrying across the dusty square with the practiced enthusiasm of a man who had given up his shame long ago. He was 50-something, with a belly that spoke of better times and a face weathered by whiskey and poor decisions. His shirt, stained with sweat under the arms, stuck to his broad back as he gestured wildly at the assembled crowd. "Good people of Dust Creek," he shouted, his voice hoarse but determined, "I come before you today with a proposition. Times are hard, I know that. You know that. We all know that. This drought has taken everything from all of us, our crops, our cattle, our hope." A few men nodded. Others shifted uncomfortably, unwilling to meet Eleanor's eyes but unable to look away entirely. "But I got something here that's worth more than gold in times like these," Dunley continued, placing a meaty hand on Eleanor's shoulder. She flinched at his touch, her jaw tightening, her gaze fixed on a point somewhere above the general store's sagging roof. "This here is Eleanor Briggs. Good stock, I assure you. She can read and write, was a school teacher back in Missouri before the hard times. She can cook, clean, sew, and she's strong despite appearances. She'll work hard for whoever takes her in." "You're talking about her like she's a horse," someone muttered from the crowd, a woman's voice, sharp with disapproval. "Times make us do things we wouldn't otherwise consider, Martha," Dunley shot back, irritation flashing across his features. "You got 6 children at home and barely enough flour to last the week. Don't you dare judge me for trying to survive." The woman, Martha Jenkins, wife of the blacksmith, fell silent, though her lips pressed into a thin, angry line. Eleanor's mind drifted as Dunley continued his pitch, his words washing over her like the hot wind that stirred the dust devils at the edge of town. How had she come to this? The question repeated itself endlessly, a litany of disbelief and sorrow. 6 months ago, she had been in St. Joseph, Missouri, teaching 12 children their letters in a one-room schoolhouse, living with her aunt in a modest but respectable home. Then the fever had come, scarlet fever, the doctor had called it, and within 2 weeks, her aunt was gone, leaving Eleanor alone with debts she couldn't pay, and a house that wasn't really hers. Thomas Dunley had appeared like a vulture circling carrion. He'd been a friend of her late uncle, he claimed, though Eleanor had never heard the man's name before. He'd offered to help settle her affairs, to give her safe passage to Texas, where he had connections and opportunities. Desperate and grieving, Eleanor had accepted, not understanding until too late that Dunley's help came with strings attached, strings that had become ropes, both figurative and literal. The journey south had been hard, traveling in a rattling wagon alongside Dunley and 2 other men whose names she'd never learned, who'd looked at her with eyes that made her skin crawl. They'd arrived in Dust Creek 3 weeks ago, and Dunley had installed her in a cramped room above the saloon, bringing her barely enough food to survive while he worked on arrangements. She'd tried to find honest work, but the town was too small, too poor, too desperate itself to take on a stranger with no family and no prospects. And then yesterday, Dunley had come to her room with the rope. 1 sack of grain, Dunley's voice cut through her reverie, sharp and insistent. That's all I'm asking, good people. 1 sack of grain, and she's yours. Think of it, a capable woman who can help with the house, the children, the crops. 1 sack of grain is nothing for what you're getting. Eleanor's eyes stung, though she refused to let tears fall. She would not give these people, these silent witnesses to her degradation, the satisfaction of seeing her break. Instead, she lifted her chin slightly, her gaze sweeping across the assembled crowd with as much dignity as she could muster. They were all there, the town's residents, or at least a representative sample. The shopkeepers and the farmers, the blacksmith and the barber, the saloon owner and the undertaker. Mrs. Henderson, the wife of the owner of Silver Ridge Ranch, stood near the back with her arms crossed, her expression unreadable. The sheriff, a tired-looking man named Garrett, who seemed older than his years, leaned against a post with his hat pulled low, making no move to intervene. Because what law was being broken, really? Eleanor wasn't a slave. Slavery had been abolished 10 years prior, but she also had no recourse, no power, no voice. In the brutal arithmetic of survival, she had become a commodity, her humanity reduced to a simple equation: 1 woman equals 1 sack of grain. Come now, Dunley pressed, desperation creeping into his voice as the silence stretched. Someone must need the help. Turner, what about you? You've got that big farm and only your wife to help. Surely a strong pair of hands would be worth a bit of grain. Abel Turner, a weathered man with a tobacco-stained beard, shifted his weight and looked away. Got no grain to spare, Dunley. Barely got enough to see us through to next planting as it is. Someone then. Anyone. Dunley's voice rose, tinged now with panic. He'd clearly expected this to be easier, expected someone to step forward immediately. Eleanor wondered distantly what would happen if no one took the offer. Would he lower the price? Try another town? Or something worse? The crowd shuffled uncomfortably, a collective entity that wanted to disperse but couldn't quite muster the will to walk away. It was like watching an accident, horrifying, but impossible to ignore. Then a voice cut through the tension, calm and steady as bedrock. I'll take her home. Every head turned as one toward the source of the voice. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat as she found herself looking at a man she hadn't noticed before, though he must have been there all along, standing at the edge of the crowd near the hitching post where several horses dozed in the heat. He was tall, well over 6 feet, with the kind of lean, muscular build that came from years of hard labor rather than excess. His hat was dusty and worn, pulled low enough to shadow his face, but even from a distance, Eleanor could see the sharp line of his jaw, the straight nose, the mouth set in a firm line. He wore a simple cotton shirt, dark with sweat at the collar and underarms, tucked into work-worn pants held up by suspenders. A bandana hung loose around his neck, and his boots were scuffed and practical. But it was his eyes that struck her, gray-blue, like storm clouds over the prairie, and filled with something that might have been anger or sorrow, or perhaps both. They were fixed not on Dunley but on Eleanor herself. And in that gaze, she saw something she hadn't expected. Recognition. Not of her specifically, but of what this moment represented. The man stepped forward, his boots thudding softly in the dust, moving with the unhurried confidence of someone accustomed to making decisions and standing by them. The crowd parted before him like water before the prow of a ship. Caleb Rourke, someone whispered. Foreman at Silver Ridge. Eleanor had heard the name but knew nothing about him except that Silver Ridge was one of the largest cattle operations in the region, and that its owner, James Henderson, commanded respect throughout the territory. Caleb stopped a few feet from where Eleanor stood, his gaze never leaving hers. Up close, she could see the fine lines at the corners of his eyes, the shadow of stubble along his jaw, the way his hands hung loose and ready at his sides. He couldn't have been much older than 30, but something in his bearing suggested he'd lived more than his years would indicate. What was that? Dunley sputtered, clearly thrown off balance by the interruption. You'll what? I said I'll take her home, Caleb repeated, his voice carrying easily without being loud. There was a quality to it, a kind of quiet authority that demanded attention. Cut those ropes off her and step aside. Dunley's face cycled through several expressions: surprise, calculation, and finally, avarice. Well, now that's fine, just fine, but the price is 1 sack of grain, as I said. You got that, Rourke? Caleb's eyes finally left Eleanor's face, swinging to Dunley with an intensity that made the older man take an involuntary step backward. I'm not buying her. I'm taking her home because no human being should be standing here like this. Now cut those ropes. The sheriff straightened slightly, his hand moving to rest on the grip of his pistol, though he made no move to draw it. Now hold on, Caleb. I don't like this any more than you do, but Dunley here says she's in his care, and unless she objects, I object. Eleanor's voice surprised even herself, cracking slightly on the second word but gaining strength. I object to all of this. I never agreed to any of this. Mr. Dunley has no legal claim to me, no guardianship papers, no authority over me whatsoever. He offered me passage to Texas under false pretenses and has held me against my will ever since we arrived. A murmur rippled through the crowd, whispers exchanged behind raised hands. Dunley's face flushed an ugly red. That's a damn lie. I've been feeding you, housing you, and this is the thanks I get? Ungrateful girl, You should step aside, Caleb interjected, his voice dropping to something quieter but infinitely more dangerous. Right now, before this gets ugly. For a long moment, Dunley seemed to consider his options. He was bigger than Caleb, heavier, but there was something in the younger man's stance, a coiled readiness, a complete lack of fear, that apparently convinced him that pushing this confrontation would end poorly. His shoulders sagged slightly, and he made a dismissive gesture with one hand. Fine. Take her. She's more trouble than she's worth anyway. Eats too much, complains constantly, and enough. Caleb moved past Dunley as if he didn't exist, crossing the remaining distance to Eleanor in 3 long strides. From his belt, he drew a knife, not threateningly, but purposefully, and Eleanor found herself holding perfectly still as he reached for her bound wrists. This might pull a bit, he said quietly, his voice meant only for her. Hold steady. She nodded, unable to find words, and watched as he slipped the blade between her wrists and the rope. He sawed carefully, mindful of her skin, and within seconds, the rope fell away, landing in the dust with a soft thump that seemed disproportionately loud in the sudden silence. Eleanor's hand sprang apart, and she immediately began rubbing at her wrists where the rope had left deep red grooves. The relief was immediate and overwhelming, and she felt her knees buckle slightly, her body suddenly weak now that the tension was broken. Caleb's hand shot out, steadying her with a gentle grip on her elbow. Easy now. When's the last time you ate? Yesterday morning, she whispered. Some bread. Not much. His jaw tightened, a muscle jumping beneath the stubble. He glanced toward the general store, then back to her. Can you ride? Yes, I can ride. Good. He turned to address the crowd, his voice rising. Anyone have a problem with what just happened? You can take it up with me. But I'm telling you right now, if I hear about anyone else trying to pull something like this in this town, there will be consequences. We're better than this. Or at least we should be. No one spoke. The sheriff nodded slowly, apparently satisfied that the situation had resolved itself without violence. Mrs. Henderson, Eleanor noticed, was smiling slightly, a look of approval on her weathered face. Caleb guided Eleanor toward his horse, a sturdy bay gelding with intelligent eyes and a patient demeanor. He untied the reins from the hitching post with one hand, keeping his other hand lightly on Eleanor's elbow, as if afraid she might collapse again. Wait! Dunley's voice rang out one more time, petulant now. She's got belongings at the saloon, clothes and such. I'll send someone for them, Caleb replied without turning around. You leave them be or you'll answer to me. He helped Eleanor up into the saddle with surprising gentleness, his hands on her waist just long enough to boost her up before he swung up behind her in one smooth motion. The horse shifted slightly under the double weight, but made no complaint. As Caleb urged the gelding forward, Eleanor found herself acutely aware of the solid warmth of his chest against her back, the strength in the arms that reached past her to hold the reins. She could smell sun-warmed cotton and leather, and underneath that, something clean and fundamentally human that made her feel, for the first time in weeks, safe. They rode slowly through town, past the watching faces, past the general store and the saloon, past the church with its white steeple and the schoolhouse that stood empty for summer. No one said a word. No one tried to stop them. The only sound was the rhythmic clop of the horse's hooves and the distant cry of a hawk circling overhead. Once they cleared the edge of town, Caleb urged the horse into an easy canter, and the hot wind that had felt suffocating in town suddenly became almost refreshing, stirring Eleanor's hair and drying the sweat on her forehead. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the motion of the horse and the fading adrenaline wash over her. "You all right?" Caleb's voice rumbled from behind her, pitched low enough that it felt almost intimate. "I don't know," she answered honestly. "I think so. I can't quite believe what just happened." "Which part? The auction or the rescue?" "Both, all of it." She paused, gathering courage, then asked the question that had been burning in her mind since he'd first spoken. "Why did you do that? You don't know me. You don't owe me anything." For a long moment he didn't answer, and Eleanor wondered if perhaps she'd overstepped, if asking too many questions might make him reconsider his intervention. But then he spoke, his voice carrying a weight that suggested old wounds, old regrets. "Because no decent man could stand there and do nothing. Because I've seen what happens when good people stay silent. Because someone had to step forward, and today, I guess that someone was me." It wasn't the answer she'd expected. She'd half thought he might claim her for himself, might reveal that his rescue had strings attached just as Dunley's help had. But there was a sincerity in his words that made something tight in her chest begin to loosen. "Where are you taking me?" she asked after another stretch of silence, watching as the landscape rolled past them. Endless prairie grass turned brown by drought, the occasional twisted mesquite tree, a sky so vast and blue it seemed to swallow everything. "Silver Ridge Ranch," he replied, "about 8 miles north of town. Mr. and Mrs. Henderson own it. They're good people." "Mrs. Henderson will help you get settled, make sure you're fed, and have a proper place to sleep. You'll be safe there." "And then what?" The question came out smaller than she'd intended, tinged with the fear that had become her constant companion over the past weeks. "What happens after that?" She felt him shift slightly in the saddle behind her, felt the breath he drew before answering. "Then you decide what you want to do. You're free, Miss Briggs, truly free. You can stay at the ranch as long as you need to, or you can move on when you're ready, but you're not beholden to anyone, not to Dunley, not to me, not to anyone." The words were simple, but their import was staggering. Freedom. The concept felt almost foreign after weeks of being controlled, manipulated, threatened. Could it really be that simple? Could this stranger truly be offering her safety without expectation? "I don't understand," she whispered. Why would the Hendersons take in a stranger? What do you get out of this?" "Peace of mind," Caleb answered immediately. "The knowledge that we did the right thing. Isn't that enough?" Eleanor didn't know how to respond to that, so she fell silent, letting the miles pass beneath them as they rode north across the drought-stricken land. The sun had begun its slow descent toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold, and despite everything, despite the trauma of the day, the uncertainty of her future, the ache in her wrists, and the hollow feeling in her stomach, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. Silver Ridge Ranch appeared on the horizon gradually, resolving itself from a distant smudge into a collection of buildings nestled in a shallow valley where a creek bed wound like a dry scar through the landscape. There was a main house 2 stories tall with a wide porch wrapped around the front and sides, several barns and outbuildings, and a network of corrals where horses and a few head of cattle milled about in the golden afternoon light. As they drew closer, Eleanor could see more details. The vegetable garden beside the house, struggling but alive despite the drought. The windmill turning slowly in the breeze. A woman in a practical dress and apron standing on the porch, one hand shading her eyes as she watched their approach. Mrs. Henderson, for Eleanor assumed this was she, was perhaps 50, with steel-gray hair pulled back in a severe bun and a face that spoke of strength tempered by kindness. She descended the porch steps as Caleb guided the horse into the yard, her expression shifting from curious to concerned as she took in Eleanor's disheveled appearance. Caleb dismounted first, then reached up to help Eleanor down. Her legs wobbled when her feet hit the ground, and she gripped his forearm for support, embarrassed by her weakness but unable to deny its reality. "Margaret," Caleb addressed Mrs. Henderson with a slight nod. "This is Eleanor Briggs. She's had a rough day and could use some help." Mrs. Henderson's eyes narrowed as they swept over Eleanor, the torn dress, the marks on her wrists, the hollow look of hunger and fear. Her lips pressed into a thin line, and when she spoke, her voice carried a hint of steel beneath the warmth. "What happened?" "Dunley tried to sell her in town," Caleb said bluntly. "Auction style, for a sack of grain." Mrs. Henderson's expression darkened, a flush of anger coloring her cheeks. "That snake, I always knew he was no good, but this?" She shook her head, then turned her full attention to Eleanor, her features softening. "Well, you're safe now, child. Come on inside. Let's get some food in you and see about those wrists." Eleanor opened her mouth to thank her, to explain, to apologize for the imposition, but Mrs. Henderson waved away whatever she'd been about to say. "No need for words right now. Come." With gentle insistence, the older woman guided Eleanor toward the house, one arm around her shoulders in a maternal gesture that made Eleanor's throat tighten with unexpected emotion. On the threshold, Eleanor paused and looked back at Caleb, who stood in the yard holding his horse's reins, watching them with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Thank you," she managed, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know how to repay—" "Don't worry about that now," he interrupted gently. "Just rest. We'll talk later." Then Mrs. Henderson was pulling her inside into the blessed coolness of the house, and Eleanor let herself be led, let herself accept this unexpected kindness, even as part of her mind whispered that nothing came free, that there must be some catch, some expectation. But as Mrs. Henderson settled her at a large wooden table in a spacious kitchen that smelled of bread and herbs, as the older woman bustled about gathering food and water and clean cloth for her wrists, Eleanor found herself wanting to believe, wanting to trust that perhaps, just perhaps, not everyone in this hard world was out to exploit her. That kindness existed even in the midst of drought and desperation. Through the kitchen window, she could see Caleb leading his horse toward one of the barns, his movements efficient and unhurried. She watched him disappear into the shadowed interior and found herself wondering about him, about the man who had stepped forward when no one else would, who had cut her ropes and offered her freedom without asking for anything in return. Who was Caleb Rourke, really? What had shaped him into someone who would make such a stand? And what did he see when he looked at her? A victim to be pitied, a problem to be solved, or something else entirely? Mrs. Henderson set a bowl of thick beef stew in front of her, along with a chunk of fresh bread and a glass of cold water drawn from the well. "Eat slowly," she cautioned. "Your stomach won't be used to it." Eleanor nodded, picking up the spoon with trembling fingers. The first bite was heaven, rich and savory, vegetables and meat in a thick gravy that seemed to warm her from the inside out. She forced herself to eat slowly as instructed, though her body wanted to devour the entire bowl in seconds. As she ate, Mrs. Henderson cleaned and bandaged her wrists with practiced efficiency, her touch gentle but sure. "These will heal quickly enough," she murmured. "No permanent damage, though you'll have some soreness for a few days." "Thank you," Eleanor whispered. "You're very kind." "Kindness has nothing to do with it," Mrs. Henderson replied firmly. "This is simple human decency. What Dunley did, what he tried to do, was unconscionable. You'll stay here as long as you need, and we'll figure out the rest as we go." Eleanor felt tears prick at her eyes for the first time since this whole ordeal had begun. "I can work," she said quickly. "I don't want to be a burden. I can cook, clean, teach if there are children who need it. I'll earn my keep, I promise." Mrs. Henderson's expression softened, and she reached out to tuck a strand of copper hair behind Eleanor's ear with surprising tenderness. "Hush now. There'll be time enough to worry about work later. For now, just focus on healing. God knows you've been through enough." The words broke something loose inside Eleanor, and suddenly the tears she'd been holding back all day came flooding out, silent and overwhelming. She bent forward over her bowl, shoulders shaking, as weeks of fear and humiliation and desperation finally found release. Mrs. Henderson said nothing, just moved closer and rested one work-roughened hand on Eleanor's shoulder, offering comfort without demanding anything in return. And in that moment, in that sun-filled kitchen in the middle of drought-stricken Texas, Eleanor Briggs began to understand that perhaps her story wasn't over after all, that perhaps, against all odds, this might be a beginning rather than an ending. Outside, the sun continued its descent toward the horizon, painting the dry land in shades of gold and amber. Somewhere in the barns, Caleb Rourke unsaddled his horse and thought about the woman with copper hair and frightened eyes, and wondered what tomorrow would bring. And in the town of Dust Creek, 8 miles south, the citizens dispersed to their homes and their worries, already beginning to forget about the auction that had taken place in their midst, already moving on to the next crisis, the next struggle for survival. But Eleanor would never forget, neither would Caleb. And in the days and weeks to come, the ripples from that hot summer afternoon would spread outward in ways neither of them could have anticipated, changing lives and futures in ways both subtle and profound. For now, though, there was food and safety, clean water and gentle hands, the promise of a bed with clean sheets, and the absence of fear. For now, that was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything. Eleanor woke to the sound of roosters crowing and the pale gray light of dawn filtering through white cotton curtains. For a disorienting moment, she couldn't remember where she was. The bed beneath her was too soft, the sheets too clean, the air too quiet, and panic fluttered in her chest like a trapped bird. Then memory returned in a rush. The auction, Caleb Rourke, the ride to Silver Ridge, Mrs. Henderson's gentle hands tending her wounds. She sat up slowly, her body protesting with a symphony of aches and pains that spoke to weeks of poor sleep and insufficient food. The room around her was simple but comfortable. Whitewashed walls, a sturdy dresser with a wash basin and pitcher, a chair by the window, and the bed she currently occupied with its quilt pieced together from dozens of different fabrics in a pattern that must have taken months to complete. Someone had laid out a clean dress on the chair, pale green cotton, that looked about her size, along with fresh undergarments and a pair of simple shoes. The kindness of it made her throat tight. She rose and crossed to the wash basin, pouring water from the pitcher and splashing her face, gasping slightly at the cold shock of it. In the small mirror hung above the dresser, she studied her reflection. Copper hair tangled and wild, face too thin, shadows like bruises under her eyes. She looked like what she was, a woman who had been surviving rather than living, who had forgotten what it felt like to be treated as human rather than burden. But her eyes, she noticed, looked different this morning. Less haunted. The constant edge of fear that had become her baseline had softened, replaced by something that might almost be hope. She dressed quickly in the borrowed clothes, which fit reasonably well, though the dress was slightly loose in the waist. Her own blue calico lay draped over the chair's arm, and she could see where Mrs. Henderson had attempted to clean it, though the dust and sweat stains had proven too stubborn to fully remove. Evidence of yesterday, permanent and indelible. Voices drifted up from below, the low murmur of conversation, the clatter of dishes, the smell of coffee and bacon that made her stomach growl with sudden, fierce hunger. Eleanor took a deep breath, smoothed her hair as best she could with her fingers, and made her way down the narrow staircase toward the kitchen. The scene that greeted her was one of comfortable domesticity. Mrs. Henderson stood at the stove, flipping bacon in a large cast-iron skillet, while a man Eleanor hadn't met yet sat at the table reading a newspaper, his reading glasses perched on the end of his nose. He was perhaps 55, with a full beard going gray, and the weathered look of someone who spent most of his time outdoors. This would be James Henderson, she surmised, owner of Silver Ridge Ranch. Both looked up as she entered, and Mrs. Henderson's face broke into a warm smile. "There you are, dear. I was wondering if you'd sleep through breakfast. Come, sit. You must be starving." "I don't want to impose," Eleanor began, but Mr. Henderson cut her off with a wave of his hand. "Nonsense. Margaret, get the girl some coffee. She looks like she needs it." His voice was gruff but not unkind, and his eyes held the same shrewd assessment Eleanor had noticed in his wife. "I'm James Henderson. You met my wife yesterday, though I imagine things were a bit overwhelming." "Eleanor Briggs," she replied, moving hesitantly toward the table. "And yes, sir. Thank you for taking me in. I promise I won't be a burden. I can work. I'm good with—" "We'll get to all that," Mrs. Henderson interrupted gently, setting a cup of steaming coffee in front of her. "First you eat. Then we talk. That's the order of things in this house." Eleanor wrapped her hands around the cup, grateful for its warmth despite the already climbing temperature outside. She sipped carefully, letting the bitter heat of it ground her in the moment, in the reality of her situation. She was safe. She was fed. She was, for the first time in weeks, among people who seemed to genuinely care about her welfare without expecting anything immediate in return. Mrs. Henderson began loading a plate with bacon, eggs, and thick slices of bread toasted golden brown. She set it before Eleanor with a look that brooked no argument. "Eat." Eleanor ate, forcing herself to pace despite the urgency of her hunger. Across the table, Mr. Henderson folded his newspaper and studied her with the kind of direct gaze that missed nothing. "Caleb told us what happened in town yesterday," he said without preamble. "That business with Dunley. Disgusting affair, if you ask me. Man should be horsewhipped." "James, bis asamissa," Henderson said warningly, but her husband shook his head. "No, Margaret, it needs saying. Miss Briggs deserves to know where we stand on the matter." He turned back to Eleanor. "What Dunley tried to do was wrong. Period. No qualifications, no excuses. You're welcome here as long as you need, and if that son of a bitch shows his face on my property, I'll shoot him for trespassing." The vehemence in his voice startled Eleanor, but it also reassured her in a way nothing else could have. These people weren't just offering empty charity. They were genuinely angry on her behalf, genuinely committed to protecting her. "Thank you," she managed around the lump in her throat. "I don't know what I would have done if Mr. Rourke hadn't stepped in." "Caleb's a good man," Mrs. Henderson said, returning to her position at the stove. "Best foreman we've ever had, and believe me, we've had a few over the years. He's got a strong sense of right and wrong, that one. Doesn't always make him easy to work with. He's got opinions, and he's not shy about sharing them. But you want someone like that on your side when things get difficult." "Where is he now?" Eleanor asked, then immediately worried she'd been too forward, too interested. But Mrs. Henderson just smiled. "Out with the hands, checking the creek beds. We're hoping for water, though honestly, I think we're all just going through the motions at this point. This drought has been going on so long, I've half forgotten what rain looks like." She paused, her expression softening. "He'll be back for lunch, I expect. The men always are. I make sure they eat properly, at least." The morning passed in a gentle rhythm that felt almost surreal to Eleanor after weeks of tension and fear. Mrs. Henderson kept her occupied with small tasks, shelling peas, folding laundry, polishing silver, work that was companionable rather than demanding, that allowed for conversation without requiring it. The older woman spoke of the ranch, of the drought's impact, of the careful management required to keep cattle alive when water was scarce and grass scarcer still. "We've had to sell off nearly half the herd," she explained as they worked side by side at the kitchen table, Eleanor's hands moving automatically through the familiar motion of splitting pea pods. "Can't sustain them all, not with the water situation what it is. James hates it. Every cow sold is money lost and years of breeding work undone, but there's no choice. You do what you have to do to survive." "That seems to be the theme of these times," Eleanor said quietly. "Everyone doing what they have to do." Mrs. Henderson's hands stilled in their work, and she looked at Eleanor with eyes that held deep understanding. "There's a difference between survival and cruelty, though. Dunley crossed a line that should never be crossed. Some things you don't do, no matter how hard times get. Some lines you don't cross." Before Eleanor could respond, the sound of boots on the porch announced someone's arrival. The kitchen door swung open, and Caleb Rourke stepped inside, pulling off his hat and running one hand through dark hair damp with sweat. His eyes found Eleanor immediately, a quick assessing look that seemed to take in everything about her current state. The clean dress, the better color in her face, the calmer set of her shoulders. "Mrs. Henderson," he acknowledged with a slight nod. Then to Eleanor, "Miss Briggs, you look better." "I feel better," she replied, aware that her heart had picked up its pace for reasons she didn't want to examine too closely. In the clear light of day, she could see him more clearly than she had yesterday, the strong planes of his face, the gray-blue eyes that seemed to hold depths she couldn't fathom, the way he moved with unconscious grace despite obvious fatigue. "Thanks to everyone's kindness. You're staying, then?" It was phrased as a question, but something in his tone suggested he already knew the answer, or at least hoped for a particular response. If Mrs. Henderson will have me, yes, at least until I can figure out what comes next. Good. The single word carried weight beyond its simple meaning. He turned to Mrs. Henderson. The South Creek bed is completely dry. Not even mud anymore, just cracked earth. We'll need to move the remaining cattle to the north pasture, see if we can make the water there stretch a bit further. Mrs. Henderson sighed, the sound heavy with worry. How much longer can we hold out? A month? Maybe 6 weeks if we're careful. Caleb's expression was grim. After that, we'll need rain, or we'll be selling off more than cattle. The horses will have to go too, all but the essentials. The conversation shifted to ranch business, technical details about water management and cattle rotation that Eleanor only partially understood. She continued her work with the peas, content to listen, to absorb the rhythms of this place that had become her unexpected sanctuary. But she was acutely aware of Caleb's presence in the room, of the way he occasionally glanced in her direction as if to reassure himself she was real, that yesterday's intervention hadn't been some fever dream born of heat and desperation. When lunch was served, thick sandwiches and cold tea, more ranch hands filtered in, 6 men in varying stages of dusty exhaustion who nodded politely to Eleanor but were too tired and hungry to do more than eat efficiently and return to their work. Caleb remained after they left, accepting a second glass of tea and settling into a chair across from where Eleanor had returned to shelling peas. "How are your wrists?" he asked, his voice pitched low enough that it felt like a private conversation despite Mrs. Henderson's presence at the sink. Eleanor held up her hands, displaying the neat bandages. "Sore, but healing. But Mrs. Henderson says they'll be fine in a few days." "Good. That's good." He seemed to struggle with something, his jaw working as if chewing on words he wasn't sure how to say. Finally, "I wanted to apologize." Eleanor's hands stilled. Apologize? For what? For not stepping in sooner, for letting it get as far as it did before He broke off, shaking his head. "I was in town for supplies. Arrived maybe 10 minutes before I spoke up. But those 10 minutes, watching you stand there while Dunley," his hands clenched on the table, "I should have moved faster." "You moved fast enough," Eleanor said firmly, surprised by the conviction in her own voice. "You stepped forward when no one else would. You cut my ropes and brought me here. I don't know what kind of timeline you think you failed, but from where I was standing, your timing was perfect." Their eyes met across the table, and something passed between them. A recognition, an understanding, a connection that Eleanor couldn't quite name but felt nonetheless, solid and real as the wooden table between them. "Miss Briggs," he began, then stopped. "Eleanor, may I call you Eleanor?" "Yes, and I'll call you Caleb, if that's all right." "It's all right." The corner of his mouth lifted in what might have been the beginning of a smile. "I wanted to explain something about why I did what I did yesterday." Eleanor waited, her hands forgotten in the bowl of peas, her full attention on the man across from her. Caleb looked down at his hands, studying them as if they held answers to questions he hadn't yet asked. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, heavy with old regret. 3 years ago, I was passing through a town in New Mexico territory. Not much different from Dust Creek. Small, poor, everybody struggling. And I saw something similar to what happened yesterday. A man trying to sell his daughter to settle a debt. She was younger than you, maybe 16, and she was crying, begging people to help her. He paused, his jaw tight. I was just passing through. Told myself it wasn't my business, wasn't my problem. Told myself that if I got involved, I'd just make things worse, that I didn't know the full situation. So I rode on, bought my supplies and left town, and I've regretted it every day since. Eleanor's chest ached with sympathy and understanding. You don't know what happened to her. No, and that's the worst part, not knowing. Did someone help her? Did her father go through with it? Did she end up in a situation worse than she was already in? He finally looked up, meeting Eleanor's gaze with eyes that held genuine pain. I swore to myself that if I ever saw something like that again, I wouldn't make the same mistake. I wouldn't ride past. I wouldn't tell myself it wasn't my problem. So when I saw you, I saw her. I saw that chance I didn't take 3 years ago. And I knew that if I walked away again, if I let it happen again, I wouldn't be able to live with myself." His voice dropped even lower. "You asked yesterday why I would help you. That's why. Not because I'm particularly noble or good, but because I'm trying to fix a mistake I made when I should have known better." Eleanor absorbed this, understanding now the fierce determination she'd seen in him yesterday, the absolute conviction that had allowed him to stand against a whole town's silent complicity. "You did fix it," she said softly. "Maybe not the mistake from 3 years ago. That's done and gone. But you fixed yesterday. You fixed my yesterday. And that matters, Caleb. That matters more than you know." The moment stretched between them, weighted with significance, until Mrs. Henderson's voice broke the spell. "Caleb Rourke, are you going to sit there all afternoon, or do you have cattle to manage?" Caleb stood abruptly, nearly knocking over his chair, and Eleanor could see the faint color rising in his neck above his collar. "Right, yes, cattle. I should—" He grabbed his hat from the table, nodded to both women, and strode toward the door with the kind of purposeful movement that suggested escape as much as duty. At the threshold, he paused and looked back at Eleanor. "I'm glad you're here. I'm glad you're safe." Then he was gone, the door swinging shut behind him, leaving Eleanor staring after him with her heart doing complicated things in her chest that she absolutely did not have time or energy to analyze. Mrs. Henderson made a small sound that might have been amusement. "That boy," she said, shaking her head. "Heart like a compass, always pointing toward what's right, but absolutely hopeless at saying what he means." "He seemed clear enough to me," Eleanor said, returning her attention to the peas with more focus than the task really required. "Did he now?" The older woman's tone was knowing, amused. "Well, that's interesting." Eleanor chose not to respond to that, but she could feel the heat in her own cheeks and knew Mrs. Henderson noticed. The afternoon wore on in comfortable productivity, and if Eleanor found her thoughts drifting repeatedly to gray-blue eyes and quiet conviction, well, that was nobody's business but her own. The days that followed developed their own rhythm, a pattern that Eleanor gradually found herself settling into with surprising ease. She rose with the sun, helped Mrs. Henderson with breakfast for the ranch hands, then spent her days assisting with the endless domestic tasks that kept a household of this size functioning. There was cooking and cleaning, mending and washing, tending the struggling vegetable garden and feeding the chickens that pecked and clucked in their enclosed yard behind the barn. It was honest work, satisfying in its tangible results, and Eleanor threw herself into it with determination born of genuine gratitude and a need to prove her worth. She would earn her place here, would make herself useful enough that her presence became asset rather than burden. But more than the work, it was the people who slowly drew her out of the protective shell she'd built during her weeks with Dunley. Mr. Henderson, gruff and practical, who nevertheless took time to show her the ranch accounts one evening and asked her opinion on the figures, clearly pleased when her Missouri school teacher's education proved useful. Mrs. Henderson, warm and motherly, who seemed to understand without being told when Eleanor needed company and when she needed solitude. And Caleb, who appeared at mealtimes with the other hands, but somehow always ended up near Eleanor, passing her bread or asking her to pass the salt, small exchanges that felt weighted with significance. Caleb, who she sometimes caught watching her from across the yard as she hung laundry or tended the garden, his expression unreadable but intent. Caleb, who kept a respectful distance, but whose presence she'd become acutely aware of, as if some internal compass had been calibrated to track his movements around the ranch. A week after her arrival, Eleanor was in the garden at twilight, trying to coax life from the struggling tomato plants, when his shadow fell across her work. She looked up to find him standing at the garden gate, hat in hand, looking oddly uncertain for a man who carried himself with such natural authority. "Evening," he said. "Evening." She sat back on her heels, brushing dirt from her hands. "Is something wrong?" No, nothing's wrong. He seemed to struggle with himself, then apparently made a decision. "Would you like to take a walk before it gets full dark? I thought maybe you'd like to see more of the ranch." Eleanor's heart did that complicated flutter thing again, but she kept her voice steady. "I'd like that. Let me wash my hands." 5 minutes later, they were walking side by side along the dusty path that led away from the main house toward the northern pastures, the sunset painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink that seemed almost obscene in their beauty against the parched landscape. They walked in silence for a while, not uncomfortable, but searching, each waiting for the other to speak first. Finally, Eleanor broke the quiet. "Mrs. Henderson told me you've been foreman here for 5 years. That's a long time." "It is," Caleb agreed. "Longest I've stayed anywhere since I left home at 17. The Hendersons are good people to work for. Fair, honest, treat their people right. Hard to find that combination." "Where's home?" "Originally, I mean." "Colorado Territory. Small town called Silver Creek, ironically enough. My father was a mining engineer, mother was a seamstress. 3 sisters, all younger." A ghost of a smile crossed his face. "They're all married now, have families of their own. I get letters sometimes, though not as often as I probably should." "Do you miss them?" He considered this. "Sometimes, but I was never much for staying in one place when I was younger. Had to see what was over the next hill, around the next bend. Drove my mother crazy." His expression grew more serious. "After that incident I told you about in New Mexico, though, I realized I needed to put down roots somewhere. Needed to be part of something, responsible to people. The Hendersons gave me that opportunity." They'd reached a fence line where a few cattle grazed in the dimming light, their dark shapes solid against the fading sky. Eleanor leaned against the fence rail, acutely aware of Caleb standing close beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him in the cooling evening air. "What about you?" he asked. "Mrs. Henderson said you were a teacher in Missouri. What brought you to Texas?" So Eleanor told him, the words coming easier than she'd expected, about her aunt's death, about Dunley's false promises, about the gradual realization that she'd traded one kind of trap for another. Caleb listened without interrupting, his attention complete and focused in a way that made her feel truly heard, truly seen. "I keep thinking about what might have happened if you hadn't been there that day," she said quietly when she'd finished. "If no one had stepped forward, where I'd be now." "Don't," Caleb said firmly. "Don't go down that road. You can't live in the might-have-beens. Trust me, I've tried, and it'll eat you alive." "Speaking from experience?" "Always." He turned to face her more fully, and in the dimming light, his features were softened, made somehow more vulnerable. "Eleanor, I need you to understand something. When I brought you here, it was because it was the right thing to do. Nothing more than that. I'm not expecting. I don't want you to feel like you owe me anything, or like there are strings attached to your being here." "I know that," Eleanor said, and was surprised to realize she meant it. "I did wonder at first. Everyone wants something. That's what I learned from Dunley. But you've never treated me like anything other than a person deserving of basic decency. Neither have the Hendersons. It's unusual and precious." "It shouldn't be unusual. It should be normal." "Should be, yes, but isn't." She studied his face in the fading light, this man who had stepped forward when others stepped back, who carried old regrets like stones in his pockets and tried to make amends through action rather than words. "Can I ask you something?" "Anything." "That girl in New Mexico, the one you didn't help, do you think you would have stepped in if it had been a boy? A man?" The question clearly surprised him. He frowned, thinking. I don't know. Maybe not. No, probably not." He looked troubled by this realization. Then maybe part of what you're trying to fix isn't just that you didn't help, but that you didn't see a person first. You saw a girl, someone who should have been able to ask men for help, and when that failed, you saw it as their failure rather than your opportunity. Caleb absorbed this in silence, and Eleanor worried she'd overstepped, had pushed too hard into territory that wasn't hers to explore. But then he nodded slowly. "You're right. I didn't think of it that way, but you're absolutely right. I saw her as someone else's responsibility, her father's, or the men in that town who knew her family. It never occurred to me that I could just help, that it could be that simple. And now? Now I know better. Now I understand that if you see something wrong and you have the power to change it, you're responsible for that choice. Doesn't matter if it's your business or not. Doesn't matter if it's convenient. You either stand up or you don't. And which one you choose says everything about who you are." They stood in companionable silence as full darkness fell and the first stars began to appear, distant and bright in the vast Texas sky. Eleanor felt something shift in her chest, a loosening of the tight knot of fear and suspicion that had become her constant companion. For the first time since her aunt's death, she felt like herself again. Not a victim, not a burden, just Eleanor Briggs, 20 years old, standing beside a good man under a canopy of stars. "We should head back," Caleb said eventually, though he made no immediate move to go. "Mrs. Henderson will worry." "She worries about everyone," Eleanor observed, "like a mother hen with too many chicks." "That's exactly what she is. It's one of the things I respect most about her. She's got enough love and worry to spread around to everyone on this ranch. And she does it without complaint." He paused. "You remind me of her sometimes." "Me?" "You've got that same quality. Even after everything you've been through, you're helping with the cooking, tending the garden, asking Mrs. Henderson what else needs doing. You're thinking about others even when you're still healing yourself." Eleanor didn't know how to respond to that, so she simply said, "I like to be useful." They walked back to the house slowly, neither seeming eager to end the conversation. At the porch steps, Caleb paused and turned to her, his expression serious in the lamplight spilling from the windows. "I'm glad you're here, Eleanor. And not just because I helped you get here. I'm glad because you're you. Because having you here makes this place better. Makes me think about things differently." Her breath caught. "Caleb, I'm not saying this right," he interrupted, frustration creeping into his voice. I don't want you to think I'm expecting anything. I just wanted you to know that your presence matters, that you matter." Eleanor's heart was pounding now, her palms damp despite the cooling air. "You matter too," she said quietly. "To me. You matter to me." The words hung between them, simple but weighted with meaning neither was quite ready to fully acknowledge. Caleb's hand lifted as if to touch her face, then dropped back to his side, propriety warring with desire. "Good night, Eleanor," he finally said, his voice rough. "Good night, Caleb." She watched him walk toward the bunkhouse where the hand slept, his figure gradually swallowed by darkness. Only when he disappeared completely did she turn and go inside, where Mrs. Henderson was waiting with knowing eyes and a small, satisfied smile. "Pleasant walk?" the older woman asked innocently. "Very," Eleanor replied, unable to keep the matching smile from her own face. The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of sun-scorched days and star-filled nights, of hard work and simple pleasures, of gradually building confidence and slowly unfurling hope. Eleanor's wrists healed completely, leaving only faint marks that would fade with time. Her face filled out as regular meals became normal rather than luxury, and color returned to her cheeks. She laughed more easily, spoke more freely, and began to remember what it felt like to exist without constant fear. And through it all, Caleb was there, not hovering, not presuming, but present in a way that felt both steady and significant. They fell into a pattern of evening walks, casual conversations that ranged from the mundane to the philosophical, silences that grew increasingly comfortable. He told her about his travels before settling at Silver Ridge, about the things he'd seen and the lessons he'd learned. She told him about her life in Missouri, about the joy she'd found in teaching, about her dreams of someday having her own school again. They didn't speak of feelings, didn't address the growing tension between them, the awareness that colored every interaction. But it was there, undeniable as the drought, as certain as the sunset, growing stronger with each passing day until Eleanor could barely remember what her life had felt like before Caleb Rourke had stepped forward and changed everything. One evening, nearly 3 weeks after her arrival at Silver Ridge, Eleanor was helping Mrs. Henderson with the supper dishes when the older woman spoke without preamble. "He's falling in love with you, you know, has been since the day he brought you here." Eleanor's hand stilled in the wash water. "Mrs. Henderson." "Oh, don't Mrs. Henderson me in that tone. I've got eyes, girl, and I've known Caleb Rourke for 5 years. I've never seen him look at anyone the way he looks at you." She fixed Eleanor with a direct stare. "Question is, how do you feel about him?" Eleanor's first instinct was to deflect, to claim she hadn't thought about it, but the lie stuck in her throat. Mrs. Henderson deserved honesty, and more than that, Eleanor deserved to be honest with herself. "I think," she said slowly, carefully, that I'm terrified. Because I care about him more than I expected to, more than I probably should, given how recently we met. But everything that happened with Dunley, everything I went through, it made me wary of trusting my own judgment. What if I'm just grateful? What if I'm confusing rescue with affection? Mrs. Henderson made a dismissive sound. Honey, do you feel the same way about James? He gave you shelter too. What about me? We fed you, clothed you, took you in. Do you have romantic feelings for us? Of course not, but that's different. Is it? Or is it that you're looking for reasons to deny what you feel because you're scared? The older woman's voice softened. I understand fear, Eleanor. God knows we've all got our share of it. But don't let what Dunley did steal more from you than he already has. Don't let him take away your chance at happiness because you're afraid to trust your own heart. Eleanor swallowed hard against the tightness in her throat. What if I trust it and I'm wrong? What if I let myself care and it all falls apart? Then it falls apart, and you pick up the pieces and move on. That's what we do. We survive. We endure. We keep going. Mrs. Henderson placed a soapy hand on Eleanor's shoulder. But what if you're right? What if this thing growing between you and Caleb is real and true and worth taking a risk for? Are you really going to let fear keep you from finding out? The question stayed with Eleanor long after the dishes were done, after she'd climbed the stairs to her borrowed room, after she'd changed into her nightgown and settled into bed. Sleep eluded her as she stared at the ceiling, thinking about choices and chances, about the difference between foolish trust and brave vulnerability. She thought about Caleb's eyes, gray-blue and earnest, about his hands, work-roughened but gentle when they'd cut her ropes, about his voice when he said her name, like it was something precious, about the way he listened when she spoke, like every word mattered, like she mattered. And she thought about herself, about who she'd been before Dunley's betrayal, and who she was becoming here at Silver Ridge, about strength and survival, about healing and hope, about the quiet courage it took to risk your heart after it had been battered. By the time dawn broke, Eleanor had made a decision. She didn't know if it was the right one, maybe nobody ever knew for certain, but it was hers, made freely and consciously, and that felt like a kind of victory in itself. She was going to trust herself. She was going to trust Caleb, and she was going to see where this path led, even if it scared her, even if the outcome was uncertain. Because Mrs. Henderson was right. Dunley had taken enough from her already. He didn't get to take this too. The morning after Eleanor's sleepless night of revelation, she found Caleb in the barn repairing a broken saddle, his hands moving with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd performed the task 1,000 times before. Sunlight slanted through the open doors, catching dust motes in the air and painting everything in shades of gold. He looked up as her shadow fell across his work, and something in his expression shifted when he saw her face. A wariness mixed with hope that told her he sensed this moment was different somehow, that whatever came next would matter. "Morning," he said, setting down the leather strap and all. "You're up early." "Couldn't sleep." Eleanor moved closer, her heart hammering against her ribs, but her steps steady. She'd made her decision in the dark hours before dawn, and now in the clear morning light she found her resolve hadn't wavered. "Caleb, can we talk? Really talk?" His eyes searched her face, reading something there that made him stand, giving her his full attention. "Of course. What's on your mind?" Eleanor took a breath, gathering her courage. "I've been thinking about what you said, about not expecting anything from me, about how I'm not beholden to you, and I appreciate that more than I can express. But there's something I need you to understand." She moved to the barn door, looking out at the sun-baked ranch spreading before them, at the life she was building here, brick by careful brick. Caleb followed, standing close enough that she could feel his presence like warmth against her back, but still maintaining that respectful distance he'd kept since the beginning. "When you cut those ropes," Eleanor continued, her voice steady despite the emotion building in her chest, "you didn't just free my hands. You gave me back something I'd lost. The ability to believe that good people still existed, that kindness wasn't always transactional, that a man could help a woman without expecting to own her afterward." She turned to face him, meeting those gray-blue eyes directly. "You gave me back my faith in humanity, Caleb. And more specifically, you gave me back my faith in myself, in my ability to judge character, to trust my instincts. Caleb's expression was carefully controlled, but she could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands had curled slightly at his sides. Eleanor, let me finish. She took another steadying breath. Mrs. Henderson asked me last night how I felt about you, and I realized I'd been afraid to even ask myself that question because I was scared my answer would be wrong, that I'd be confusing gratitude with affection, rescue with love. The word hung between them, stark and honest. But I've had 3 weeks now to sort through my feelings. 3 weeks of watching you, talking with you, learning who you are beyond the man who stepped forward that day in town. And what I've learned is that my gratitude and my affection aren't the same thing at all. They just happen to both be directed at you. She saw his throat work as he swallowed, saw the way his chest rose and fell with carefully controlled breathing. But he said nothing, letting her speak, giving her the space to finish what she'd started. I care about you, Caleb Rourke, Eleanor said simply, the words feeling both terrifying and liberating. Not because you saved me, though I'll always be grateful for that, but because of who you are. Because you're kind without being soft, strong without being cruel, principled without being rigid. Because you listen when I talk and you make me laugh, and you look at me like I'm a person worth knowing, not a problem to be solved or a burden to be managed. Her voice dropped lower, more intimate. I care about you, and I needed you to know that. Not because I expect anything in return, but because keeping it to myself felt like a different kind of dishonesty. The silence that followed stretched between them like a physical thing, waited and waiting. Eleanor's heart was pounding so hard she was certain Caleb must be able to hear it. She'd laid herself bare, made herself vulnerable in a way she hadn't dared since before Dunley's betrayal, and now she could only wait to see how he would respond. When Caleb finally spoke, his voice was rough with emotion barely contained. Eleanor, He stopped, seemed to struggle with himself, then stepped closer, close enough now that she had to tilt her head back to maintain eye contact. I've been trying so hard to do the right thing, to keep my distance, to make sure you felt safe, to never take advantage of what you've been through. But the truth is, keeping that distance has been the hardest thing I've ever done. His hand lifted, hesitated, then gently cupped her cheek, his palm warm and slightly rough against her skin. Eleanor leaned into the touch instinctively, her eyes fluttering closed for just a moment at the simple rightness of it. I think about you constantly, Caleb continued, his thumb brushing softly across her cheekbone. I wake up thinking about whether you slept well. I spend my days finding excuses to come back to the house, hoping I'll catch a glimpse of you. I lie awake at night remembering things you said, the way you laugh, the little crease that appears between your eyebrows when you're concentrating. He gave a short, self-deprecating laugh. I'm gone on you, Eleanor Briggs. Have been since that first evening walk when you called me out for only seeing that girl in New Mexico as someone's daughter instead of as a person in her own right. You're brilliant and brave and beautiful, and spending time with you has become the best part of my days. Eleanor's breath caught, her hand lifting to cover his where it still rested against her face. Then why the distance? Why all the careful propriety? Because I was terrified, Caleb admitted. Terrified that if I pushed too fast or came on too strong, you'd feel obligated. That you'd say yes because you felt you owed me, not because you actually wanted to. The last thing I ever wanted was for you to feel trapped again, even in a gilded cage of kindness. His eyes searched hers with an intensity that made her feel seen down to her soul. I needed you to have time and space to heal, to figure out what you wanted without pressure from me, even if what you wanted was to leave, to build a life somewhere else, with someone else. I don't want someone else, Eleanor said firmly. I want you, not because you saved me, but because of every moment since, because you gave me space when I needed it, and presence when I craved it, because you see me as whole and capable even when I feel broken and lost. She moved closer still, until barely a breath separated them. I want to see where this goes, Caleb. I want to stop pretending there's nothing between us and actually explore what there could be. Are you sure? His voice was barely above a whisper now, his free hand coming to rest lightly on her waist. Because once we cross this line, I'm not going to be able to go back. I'm already in too deep as it is. I'm sure. Eleanor rose up on her toes, bringing her face level with his, so close she could see the darker ring around his irises, could count the individual whiskers along his jaw. I'm terrified and uncertain and still healing from everything that happened, but I'm sure about this. About you. About us. The kiss, when it finally came, was gentle and questioning, a soft press of lips that asked permission even as it granted it. Eleanor felt something unfurl in her chest, a tight knot of fear and doubt loosening under the tenderness of Caleb's touch. His arms came around her, careful but secure, holding her close without constraining her, and she let herself sink into the embrace, into the moment, into the terrifying and wonderful reality of allowing herself to feel again. When they finally broke apart, both slightly breathless, Caleb rested his forehead against hers, his eyes closed, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Well," he said softly, "that was worth the wait." Eleanor laughed, the sound surprising her with its ease and joy. "Just 3 weeks, Caleb, hardly an eternity." Felt like one. He pulled back just far enough to look at her properly, his hand still resting on her waist. "Eleanor, I need you to know that this doesn't change anything about your place here. You're still free to stay or go as you choose, still free to change your mind if—" She silenced him with another kiss, this one more confident, more certain. "Stop trying to give me an exit before we've even started," she murmured against his lips. "I know what I'm choosing. Trust me to make my own decisions." "I do trust you. It's myself I'm not sure about. Whether I can be what you need, whether—" "Caleb!" Eleanor cupped his face in both hands, making him look at her. "You already are what I need. You're honest and kind and good. You challenge me to think differently and support me when I'm struggling. You make me feel safe without making me feel helpless. What more could I possibly need?" His expression softened into something that looked almost like wonder. "How did I get this lucky?" "We both got lucky," Eleanor corrected. "In the middle of drought and hardship and desperation, we found each other. That's not luck, that's grace." They stood there in the barn doorway, wrapped in each other's arms as the morning sun climbed higher and the ranch began to stir with the day's activities. Eventually, the sound of Mrs. Henderson calling for breakfast broke the spell, and they reluctantly separated, though Caleb kept hold of Eleanor's hand as they walked toward the house. "She's going to give us that knowing look," Eleanor predicted, fighting back a smile. "She's been giving us that knowing look for 2 weeks now," Caleb replied, his thumb tracing circles on the back of her hand. "This will just confirm what she already suspected." He was right. The moment they entered the kitchen together, Mrs. Henderson took one look at their linked hands and their matched expressions of quiet happiness, and her face broke into a triumphant grin. "Well, it's about time," she announced to the room at large. "I was beginning to think you two would dance around each other until the drought broke." Mr. Henderson looked up from his coffee, took in the situation with a single glance, and nodded approvingly. "Good," seeing that. He raised his coffee cup in a small toast. "You have my blessing, for whatever that's worth, both of you." Eleanor felt warmth bloom in her chest at the casual acceptance, at the way these people who had become like family simply folded this new development into the fabric of their daily life without drama or complication. This was what family felt like, she realized. Not blood and obligation, but choice and care. The decision to support each other through whatever came. The days that followed took on a new quality, like the world had been repainted in brighter colors. Eleanor still helped Mrs. Henderson with household tasks, still tended the struggling garden and fed the chickens. But now there were stolen moments throughout the day, Caleb finding excuses to come by the house, their hands brushing as they passed in doorways, quiet conversations on the porch after supper while the stars emerged overhead. They talked about everything and nothing, sharing stories from their pasts and dreams for their futures. Eleanor told him about the students she'd taught in Missouri, about the satisfaction she'd found in watching understanding dawn on a child's face when they finally grasped a difficult concept. Caleb spoke of his travels, of the places he'd seen and the lessons he'd learned, of the gradual realization that home wasn't a place but a feeling, a sense of belonging he'd found here at Silver Ridge. "Do you miss teaching?" Caleb asked one evening as they sat on the porch steps, watching the sunset paint the sky in impossible shades of orange and crimson. Every day, Eleanor admitted, but there's no school here. The nearest one is in Dust Creek, and she trailed off, not needing to finish the sentence. The memory of that town square, of standing with bound wrists while people looked away, was still too fresh to imagine herself returning there regularly. What if you started your own school here? Caleb suggested. There are families scattered throughout the area, plenty of children who need education. You could teach here at the ranch. We've got that storage building by the north barn that's barely used. It could be converted easily enough. Eleanor turned to look at him, surprise and hope warring in her expression. Do you really think that's possible? Why not? We've got the space, and God knows the children around here need a teacher. Most of them can barely read, let alone cipher or write properly. He took her hand, threading their fingers together. You've got the skills and the passion for it. Why shouldn't you put them to use? It's a beautiful thought, Eleanor said slowly, but I couldn't afford. The families would pay what they could, Caleb interrupted. Not much, maybe, with times being so hard, but between that and your room and board here, you'd manage, and more importantly, you'd be doing something you love, something that matters. He squeezed her hand gently. You don't have to decide now. Just think about it. Eleanor did think about it, turning the idea over in her mind as she went about her daily tasks. A school of her own, built on her own terms, teaching children who genuinely needed what she had to offer. It felt like a dream, too good to be real, but the more she considered it, the more possible it seemed. She mentioned it to Mrs. Henderson one afternoon while they were preserving what little fruit the drought-stressed trees had managed to produce. The older woman's face lit up immediately. What a wonderful idea! Oh, Eleanor, you should absolutely do it. There are at least a dozen families within riding distance who would send their children. I'm certain of it. You don't think it's too ambitious? Too soon? I think it's exactly the right amount of ambitious at exactly the right time, Mrs. Henderson replied firmly. You've spent 3 weeks healing, finding your feet again. Now it's time to start building the life you want, not just surviving in the life you've got. She paused in her work, fixing Eleanor with a knowing look. And having a purpose of your own, something that's yours apart from Caleb or this ranch, will only make your relationship stronger. You'll be two whole people choosing each other, not two half people trying to become complete. The wisdom in those words struck Eleanor deeply. Mrs. Henderson was right. She needed something that was hers, an identity beyond rescued woman or Caleb's sweetheart. Teaching had always made her feel most herself, most capable and confident. Why shouldn't she reclaim that? Over the next week, Eleanor threw herself into planning. She walked out to the storage building Caleb had mentioned, taking measurements and making notes. She compiled a mental list of families she'd heard mentioned, children of various ages who might benefit from formal schooling. She sketched out a basic curriculum, remembering her training from the teaching college in St. Louis, adapting it for the realities of ranch life and limited resources. Caleb helped however he could, offering to speak with families he knew, promising to help convert the building into a proper schoolroom during his spare time. Mr. Henderson donated lumber and supplies, refusing Eleanor's protests that it was too much. Consider it an investment in the community's future, he said gruffly. Smart children grow into capable adults, and God knows we need more of those. One afternoon, as Caleb and 2 of the ranch hands were cleaning out the storage building, Eleanor stood in the doorway watching them work, her mind already furnishing the space with desks and a blackboard, hearing the imagined sounds of children's voices raised in recitation. She was so lost in her vision of the future that she didn't hear Caleb approach until he spoke from directly behind her. "Penny for your thoughts." Eleanor leaned back against him, letting his arms come around her waist, savoring the solid comfort of his presence. "I was just imagining it all set up. Desks in rows, primers on the shelves, a globe by the window, children bent over their slates, practicing their letters." "It's going to be wonderful," Caleb said with absolute conviction. "You're going to be wonderful. Those children don't know how lucky they are." Eleanor turned in his arms, looping her own around his neck. "I never thanked you properly for this, for encouraging me, for making it possible." "You don't need to thank me. This is all you, Eleanor. Your dream, your work, your future." "Our future," she corrected softly. If you want it to be. Caleb's expression grew serious, his eyes searching hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. Is that what you want? A future with me? Yes. The word came without hesitation, without doubt. I know it's fast. I know we've only been whatever we are for a few weeks. But yes, Caleb, I want a future with you. I want to build this school and teach these children and come home to you at the end of every day. I want Sunday dinners with the Hendersons and evening walks under the stars and all the small, ordinary moments that make up a life. She paused, then added more quietly, I want to wake up beside you and fall asleep in your arms and everything in between. I want it all, if you do. For a moment, Caleb simply stared at her, his expression cycling through surprise, joy, and something that looked almost like disbelief. Then he was kissing her, deep and thorough, pouring everything he couldn't say into the press of his lips, the gentle demand of his mouth, the way his hands tangled in her hair and pulled her closer still. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Caleb rested his forehead against hers and whispered, I want it all too, every bit of it, with you. They stood there in the doorway of what would become Eleanor's schoolhouse, wrapped in each other and in dreams of a future that had seemed impossible just a month ago. Around them, the drought-stricken ranch carried on with its daily rhythms, but in this moment, in this space between heartbeats and breaths, Eleanor felt richness beyond measure. The building conversion took 3 weeks of steady work. Caleb and the ranch hands devoted every spare moment to the project, and Eleanor found herself constantly amazed by the transformation. What had been a cluttered storage space gradually emerged as a proper schoolroom. Walls whitewashed clean, windows scrubbed until they sparkled, a floor sanded smooth and swept. Mr. Henderson commissioned a proper blackboard from a carpenter in the next town over, and Mrs. Henderson donated an old desk that had belonged to her mother, polishing it until the wood gleamed. Eleanor made the 30-mile trip to the nearest large town with Mrs. Henderson one sweltering day in late August, using money she'd carefully saved from doing mending work for neighboring ranches. They returned with primers, slates, chalk, and a beautiful globe that Eleanor cradled like precious cargo the entire journey home. It's really happening, she breathed as they unloaded their purchases, carefully arranging books on the shelves Caleb had built. I'm really going to do this. You're really going to do this, Mrs. Henderson confirmed with a warm smile, and you're going to be magnificent at it. The first day of school was set for the first Monday in September, giving families time to prepare and giving Eleanor time to battle the rising tide of nervousness that threatened to overwhelm her. What if no one came? What if she'd misjudged the community's interest? What if parents didn't trust a woman who'd been auctioned in the town square to teach their children? Caleb found her the night before school was set to start, pacing the length of the finished schoolroom in the lamplight, her anxiety written clearly across her face. He caught her hand as she passed, pulling her to a stop. Talk to me. What's going on in that head of yours? Eleanor sighed, leaning into him. What if I've made a mistake? What if no one shows up tomorrow? What if they remember what happened with Dunley and decide I'm not fit to teach their children? First of all, Caleb said firmly, what happened with Dunley wasn't your fault, and anyone with half a brain knows that. Second, I've spoken with at least 8 families personally, and every single one of them is planning to send their children. Mrs. Henderson has spoken with even more. You're going to have a full schoolroom, I promise you. But what if I've forgotten how to teach? It's been months since Eleanor. Caleb cupped her face in both hands, making her look at him. You haven't forgotten anything. Teaching is in your bones, part of who you are. Tomorrow, you're going to walk into this schoolroom and you're going to do what you were born to do. And I'm going to be so damn proud of you I might burst with it. Despite her anxiety, Eleanor felt a smile tug at her lips. You're biased. Absolutely. Doesn't make me wrong. He kissed her forehead, then her nose, then finally her mouth, soft and sweet. You've got this. I believe in you completely. The next morning dawned clear and bright, the air already warm by the time Eleanor dressed in her best dress, a gift from Mrs. Henderson, pale blue with small white flowers that made her feel both professional and pretty. She braided her copper hair into a neat coronet, took a deep breath to settle her nerves, and made her way to the schoolhouse. To her amazement and profound relief, Children were already arriving with their parents, some on horseback, others in wagons. She counted them as they came: 3 children from the Porter family, 4 from the Mitchells, 2 from the widow Lawson. By the time she rang the bell to signal the start of school, she had 17 students ranging in age from 6 to 14, their faces reflecting varying degrees of excitement, nervousness, and suspicion. Eleanor stood before them, her heart pounding but her voice steady as she introduced herself. "Good morning. My name is Miss Briggs and I'll be your teacher. Some of you may know me, some may not. I'm originally from Missouri, where I taught in a one-room schoolhouse, much like this one. I love reading and learning and helping others discover the joy of knowledge. My goal is to help each of you learn to read, write, and cipher well enough that you'll have choices in your futures, choices about what you do, where you go, who you become." She paused, letting her gaze sweep across the room, meeting the eyes of each student in turn. "I know times are hard right now. I know that for many of you, coming to school means time away from helping your families with necessary work. I won't waste that time. Every moment we spend together will be focused on giving you the skills and knowledge you need to build the best possible future for yourselves." A hand shot up. One of the older boys, maybe 13, with skepticism written clearly across his sunburned face. "My pa says reading's not as important as knowing how to work cattle. Says book learning is for city folks." Eleanor nodded, acknowledging the challenge without defensiveness. "Your father's right that knowing how to work cattle is important, especially here in cattle country. But reading and writing open doors that would otherwise stay closed. They let you keep records of your herd, calculate fair prices so no one can cheat you, write letters to buyers in other states, read contracts before you sign them. Book learning doesn't replace practical skills. It enhances them, makes them more valuable." The boy considered this, then nodded slowly, apparently satisfied. Other students began to relax, sensing that Eleanor wasn't there to lecture them about their lives, but to give them tools they could actually use. The morning passed in a blur of assessments as Eleanor worked to understand each student's current level of learning. Some could barely recognize letters, while others could read simple texts with relative ease. She made notes, already planning how to group them for different lessons, how to challenge the advanced students while supporting those who were struggling. At midday, the children poured out for lunch and free time, their voices rising in shouts and laughter as they ran off energy accumulated during the morning's focus. Eleanor stood in the schoolhouse doorway, watching them play, and felt a sense of rightness settle over her like a warm blanket. This was where she belonged. This was what she was meant to do. "Looks like it went well." Caleb's voice came from behind her, and she turned to find him leaning against the building's corner, his hat pushed back and a smile on his face. "You were watching?" "I might have found excuses to work in the north pasture this morning," he admitted, not sounding remotely apologetic. "Wanted to make sure everything went smoothly." Eleanor crossed to him, standing close enough that she could speak quietly without being overheard by the playing children. "It went better than well. It went perfectly. I have students at all different levels, which means I'll need to be creative with my lesson planning, but Caleb, they're eager to learn. You can see it in their eyes. Just like you're eager to teach them." He brushed a stray curl back from her face, his touch gentle. "I'm so proud of you, Eleanor. You took everything that happened and turned it into something beautiful." "We did," Eleanor corrected. "I couldn't have done this without you, without the Hendersons, without this community giving me a second chance." "You gave yourself the second chance. We just helped make it possible." The afternoon session went as smoothly as the morning, and by the time Eleanor dismissed the students for the day, she felt both exhausted and exhilarated. Several parents lingered to thank her, to express their approval, to promise their continued support. As the last wagon pulled away and silence settled over the schoolhouse, Eleanor allowed herself a moment of pure satisfaction. She'd done it. Against all odds, despite everything she'd been through, she'd built something real and meaningful. She had purpose again, identity beyond her trauma. She was Eleanor Briggs, schoolteacher, and that simple fact felt like reclaiming a piece of herself she'd thought lost forever. Caleb appeared as she was locking the schoolhouse door, having somehow known exactly when she'd need him. He fell into step beside her as they walked back toward the main house, their hands finding each other naturally. "Mrs. Henderson's making a special dinner to celebrate your first day," he said. Fair warning, she's been cooking since noon, and I'm pretty sure she's made enough food for 30 people. Eleanor laughed, the sound free and easy. That sounds perfect. Eleanor? Caleb stopped walking, tugging her hand to make her face him. The setting sun painted everything in gold, making his eyes seem almost luminous. I need to tell you something. Her heart skipped at the serious note in his voice, but his expression was open, vulnerable rather than troubled. What is it? I love you. The words were simple, direct, delivered with the same quiet certainty he brought to everything else. I know we agreed to take things slow, to not rush, but I can't keep pretending I don't feel what I feel. I love you, Eleanor Briggs. I love your strength and your compassion, your intelligence and your determination. I love the way you bite your lip when you're thinking hard about something, and the way you laugh at my terrible jokes even when they're not funny. I love who you are and who you're becoming, and I needed you to know that. Eleanor felt tears prick at her eyes, but they were good tears, the kind born of overwhelming emotion rather than pain. I love you too, she whispered, the words feeling both monumental and natural, as inevitable as sunrise. I think I've loved you since that first evening walk. When you told me about the girl you didn't help, and I realized you were someone who carried his mistakes like lessons instead of making excuses for them. Caleb pulled her close, his arms coming around her with a certainty that made her feel cherished and safe. So we're doing this? Really doing this? We're already doing this, Eleanor pointed out, her voice muffled against his chest. Have been for weeks now. We're just finally saying it out loud. Then say it again, Caleb requested, pulling back just far enough to see her face. Please. I love you, Caleb Rourke, Eleanor said clearly, each word deliberate and true. I love you with everything I am and everything I'm becoming. I love you in my past and my present and every possible future I can imagine. The kiss he gave her in response was unlike their previous kisses, deeper, more intense, flavored with the certainty of mutual love acknowledged and accepted. Eleanor rose up into it, her fingers tangling in his hair, her body pressed against his, as if she could somehow get closer still, as if physical proximity could express what words couldn't quite capture. When they finally broke apart, breathless and slightly dazed, the sun had slipped below the horizon and the first stars were beginning to appear overhead. From the house, they could hear Mrs. Henderson calling that dinner was ready, but neither of them moved immediately, reluctant to break the spell of this perfect moment. We should go in, Eleanor finally said, though she made no move to actually leave Caleb's arms. We should, Caleb agreed, also not moving. Mrs. Henderson went to a lot of trouble. She'll understand if we're a few minutes late. She'll give us that knowing look again. She gives us that look anyway. Eleanor laughed, finally stepping back but keeping hold of Caleb's hand. Come on, let's go celebrate everything we've built. The school, us, this impossible second chance we've both been given. They walked toward the house together, hands linked and hearts full. While above them, the Texas sky deepened into purple twilight, and the ranch settled into evening's peace. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new students to teach, new obstacles to navigate. But tonight, there was love and celebration, community and belonging, the profound satisfaction of knowing she'd traveled through fire and emerged not just intact but transformed, stronger and more certain of who she was and what she wanted. Eleanor Briggs had been auctioned for a sack of grain and rescued by a cowboy's conscience. But what came after? The healing and the growth, the love and the purpose that she'd built herself, brick by careful brick, choice by deliberate choice. And standing on the porch of Silver Ridge Ranch with Caleb beside her and her future spreading out before them like an unwritten book, she finally understood that sometimes the end of one story was really just the beginning of another, better one. The celebration dinner that evening was everything Mrs. Henderson had promised and more. The long table practically groaned under the weight of roasted chicken, fresh bread, vegetables from the struggling garden coaxed into abundance through sheer determination, and a peach cobbler that filled the house with the scent of cinnamon and sugar. Mr. Henderson raised his glass in a toast to Eleanor's first successful day of teaching, and the warmth in his gruff voice made her throat tight with gratitude. To new beginnings, he declared, and to the courage it takes to build something from nothing. To Eleanor, Mrs. Henderson added, her eyes suspiciously bright, who reminds us all that strength isn't about never falling down. It's about getting back up and building something beautiful from the broken pieces. Eleanor felt Caleb's hand find hers under the table, his fingers threading through hers with easy familiarity. She squeezed back, overwhelmed by the simple perfection of this moment, sitting at a table with people who had become family, celebrating work that gave her purpose, holding hands with a man who loved her for exactly who she was. 3 months ago, she'd been standing in a dusty street with her wrists bound, her future stolen. Now she had more future than she knew what to do with, stretching out before her in possibilities that seemed almost limitless. After dinner, while Mrs. Henderson shooed them out of the kitchen with firm insistence that she'd handle the dishes herself, Caleb took Eleanor's hand and led her away from the house, not toward their usual evening walk route, but in a different direction entirely. The moon was nearly full, bathing the landscape in silver light that made everything look painted in shades of pewter and shadow. "Where are we going?" Eleanor asked, trusting him completely, even as curiosity bubbled up inside her. "You'll see," was all Caleb would say, a mysterious smile playing at the corners of his mouth. They walked for perhaps 20 minutes, following a barely visible path that wound up through scrubby vegetation and over a rise that Eleanor hadn't explored before. As they crested the hill, her breath caught. Below them, the land opened up into a small valley where wildflowers somehow still bloomed despite the drought. Bluebonnets and Indian paintbrush, their colors muted by moonlight but their presence unmistakable. A lone cottonwood tree stood at the valley's heart, its branches spreading wide like a benediction. "How is this possible?" Eleanor breathed, staring at the impossible splash of color in a landscape that had been brown and dying for months. "Everything else is so dry, but this—" "Underground spring," Caleb explained, leading her down into the valley, "feeds this one spot and nothing else. I found it about 2 years ago while tracking a stray calf. Mr. Henderson doesn't even know about it. I've kept it as my own secret place, somewhere to come when I need to think or remember that not everything beautiful has to die just because times are hard." They reached the cottonwood tree, and Eleanor could see that Caleb had been here earlier. A blanket was spread beneath the branches, along with a basket that likely held Mrs. Henderson's complicity in whatever he'd planned. Eleanor turned to him with raised eyebrows, fighting back a smile. "You're very sure of yourself, Mr. Rourke. What if I'd said I was too tired for a walk?" "Then I would have accepted that and saved this for another night," Caleb replied easily, but there was nervousness beneath his casual tone, a tension in his shoulders that suggested whatever came next mattered deeply to him. "But I was hoping you wouldn't be too tired. I wanted to bring you here, show you this place. I wanted—" He trailed off, seeming to search for words. Eleanor moved closer, placing her palm flat against his chest where she could feel his heart hammering beneath her hand. "You wanted what?" Caleb covered her hand with his own, holding it there against his heart. "I wanted to ask you something important, but I'm suddenly finding it harder than I expected to get the words out." Understanding began to dawn, making Eleanor's own heart race to match his. "Caleb, wait, I need to say this right." He took a deep breath, then another, his eyes never leaving hers. "Eleanor Briggs, 3 months ago I watched you stand in a town square with your dignity intact, despite everything trying to strip it away. I saw your strength, your courage, your refusal to break even when breaking would have been the easier path, and something in me recognized something in you, like calling to like, soul to soul." He reached up to cup her face with his free hand, his thumb brushing across her cheekbone with infinite tenderness. "These past months I've watched you heal and grow and become even more of who you were always meant to be. I've fallen in love with your intelligence and your compassion, your determination, and your gentleness. I've fallen in love with the way you bite your lip when you're concentrating, the way you laugh with your whole body, the way you see the best in people even when they've given you every reason not to." Eleanor felt tears beginning to track down her cheeks, but she made no move to wipe them away, too focused on Caleb's face, on the emotion written clearly across his features. "I know it's fast," Caleb continued, his voice growing rougher with feeling. "I know by any reasonable standard we should wait longer, take more time. But Eleanor, I've never been more certain of anything in my entire life. I love you. I want to build a life with you. I want to wake up beside you every morning and fall asleep with you in my arms every night. I want to watch you teach and support your dreams and raise children together if we're blessed with them. I want to grow old with you, see what our lives look like in 10 years, 20, 50. He released her hand and dropped to one knee there beneath the cottonwood tree, surrounded by impossible flowers and silver moonlight, and pulled a small box from his pocket. Eleanor's hands flew to her mouth, muffling the sob of surprise and joy that escaped. Eleanor Briggs, Caleb said, opening the box to reveal a simple gold band with a small but beautiful diamond catching the moonlight. Will you marry me? Will you take this broken cowboy who's trying his best to be a good man and make him the happiest person alive by agreeing to be his wife? For a moment, Eleanor couldn't speak past the emotion clogging her throat, could barely see through the tears blurring her vision. But when she finally found her voice, it was steady and certain, carrying not a shadow of doubt. Yes. The word came out as barely more than a whisper, so she said it again, louder, more certain. Yes, Caleb Rourke, I'll marry you. 1,000 times, yes. Caleb surged to his feet, catching her up in his arms and spinning her around, both of them laughing and crying at once. When he finally set her down, his hands were shaking slightly as he took the ring from its box and slipped it onto her finger. It fit perfectly, catching the light and throwing tiny rainbows across her hand. How did you know my size? Eleanor asked, staring at the ring in wonder. Mrs. Henderson helped. I went into town 2 weeks ago, picked this out, and she confirmed I'd guessed right. He smiled sheepishly. I've been carrying it around ever since, waiting for the right moment. Was starting to think I'd lose my nerve. You picked it out 2 weeks ago? Eleanor's eyes widened. Before we even said we loved each other? I've known how I felt for longer than 2 weeks, Caleb admitted. I was just waiting for the right time to say it, to make sure you felt the same. But yes, I bought the ring before I knew for certain, because even then, I was sure. Sure that you were the one. Sure that I wanted to spend the rest of my life with you. Sure that no matter how scared I was of moving too fast or presuming too much, the thought of not asking you was infinitely worse. Eleanor launched herself at him, wrapping her arms around his neck and kissing him with all the love and joy and certainty bubbling up inside her. Caleb caught her easily, his arms banding around her waist, lifting her slightly off the ground as he returned the kiss with equal fervor. They stayed like that for a long moment, wrapped in each other and in the magnitude of what they'd just promised, before finally breaking apart to breathe. We should tell the Hendersons, Eleanor said, though she made no move to leave the circle of Caleb's arms. Mrs. Henderson will be bursting with curiosity by now. She knew I was planning to propose tonight, Caleb admitted. She's probably got champagne chilling and another cake baked just waiting for us to come back and announce it. Eleanor laughed, the sound bright and free in the quiet night. Of course she does. I swear that woman knows everything that happens on this ranch before it happens. They settled onto the blanket beneath the cottonwood, unwilling to leave this magical place quite yet, needing a few more moments alone with their news before sharing it with the world. Caleb produced a bottle of wine and 2 glasses from the basket, along with some of Mrs. Henderson's bread and cheese, and they shared an impromptu midnight picnic surrounded by wildflowers and starlight. When should we get married? Eleanor asked, leaning against Caleb's shoulder while his arm wrapped securely around her waist. I know we should probably wait, be practical, but you don't want to wait, Caleb finished, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. Neither do I. What would you think about a Christmas wedding? That gives us 3 months to plan, to let families know, to make whatever arrangements need making. Long enough to be respectable, but not so long that we're torturing ourselves with waiting. A Christmas wedding, Eleanor repeated, tasting the words and finding them perfect. I love that. Although, she hesitated, a shadow passing across her face. What is it? I don't have family to invite. My aunt is gone, my parents died when I was young, and I have no siblings. It'll just be me standing up there, alone on my side, while you have... Hey. Caleb turned her to face him, his hands gentle but insistent on her shoulders. First of all, you're not alone. You have the Hendersons, who love you like a daughter. You have your students and their families who already think the world of you. You have a whole community here that's come to care about you. And second, you have me, which means you have my family too. My parents and sisters, once they meet you, are going to love you. You'll have more family than you know what to do with." Eleanor blinked back fresh tears, overwhelmed by the truth of his words. She wasn't alone anymore. Somewhere between that terrible day in Dust Creek and this perfect night beneath the cottonwood tree, she'd built a life filled with people who cared about her, who supported her, who chose her. Not because they had to, not out of obligation or pity, but because of who she was. "I love you," she whispered, the words feeling simultaneously inadequate and exactly right. "I love you so much it terrifies me sometimes." "I know the feeling," Caleb murmured against her hair. "But we'll figure it out together. That's what marriage is, isn't it? Two people choosing each other every day, working through the scary parts, and celebrating the beautiful parts. Building something bigger than either of them could build alone." They stayed in the valley until the moon had traveled halfway across the sky, talking about everything and nothing, about what kind of ceremony they wanted, about where they'd live after the wedding, about dreams and hopes, and the future they'd build together. Eleanor learned that Caleb had been saving money for years, enough to buy a small parcel of land if the opportunity arose. Caleb learned that Eleanor wanted at least 3 children, maybe 4, and that she'd always dreamed of having a library room filled floor to ceiling with books. "We'll make it happen," Caleb promised. "All of it. Maybe not all at once, maybe not as fast as we'd like, but we'll build it together, our home, our family, our life." When they finally made their way back to the ranch house, they found the windows still glowing with lamplight despite the late hour. Mrs. Henderson met them at the door, took one look at Eleanor's radiant face and the ring glinting on her finger, and let out a whoop of joy that probably woke half the ranch. "James! James, get in here! They're engaged!" She pulled Eleanor into a crushing hug, then Caleb, then both of them together. "Oh, I'm so happy I could burst. When? Tell me when." "Christmas," Eleanor managed, laughing at the older woman's enthusiasm. "We're thinking Christmas Day, if that's not too presumptuous. Christmas is perfect, absolutely perfect." Mrs. Henderson was already mentally planning, Eleanor could tell, her eyes distant with visions of decorations and food and guest lists. "We'll have the ceremony here at the ranch, of course. The main room is plenty big enough, and we can decorate with evergreen boughs and we'll need to get you a proper dress. I know a seamstress in—" "Margaret, let them breathe," Mr. Henderson interrupted, appearing from his study with a smile on his weathered face. He shook Caleb's hand firmly, then pulled Eleanor into a brief but warm embrace. "Congratulations to you both. Caleb, you're getting a remarkable woman. Eleanor, you're getting a good man. I expect you'll both be very happy together." "We will be," Caleb said with absolute certainty, his arm coming around Eleanor's waist. "I'll make sure of it." The next few weeks passed in a blur of school days and wedding planning, of teaching fractions and choosing flowers, of everyday ranch work and excited discussions about the future. Eleanor wrote letters to Caleb's family in Colorado, introducing herself and inviting them to the wedding. Caleb's mother wrote back immediately, her letter warm and welcoming, expressing her joy at her son's happiness and her eagerness to meet the woman who'd captured his heart. Eleanor's students noticed the ring and peppered her with questions that she answered with patient good humor, using the opportunity to teach them about letter writing as they composed congratulatory notes. Several of the ranch families offered to help with the wedding preparations, and Eleanor was moved to tears more than once by the generosity and genuine happiness people expressed on her behalf. The school continued to thrive. Eleanor had settled into a rhythm with her teaching, grouping students by ability level for different subjects, and finding creative ways to keep everyone engaged and learning. She started a lending library using her own books and donations from families, and began staying late twice a week to offer evening classes for adults who wanted to improve their reading and writing skills. The community's response was overwhelming. Ranchers and ranch wives who'd never had the opportunity for formal education showed up faithfully, their desire to learn evident in their careful attention and diligent practice. One evening in late October, as Eleanor was helping a leather-faced cowboy work through a passage about horse husbandry, she looked around the lamplight schoolroom and felt a swell of pride so intense it was almost painful. This was hers. She had built this, created this space where people of all ages could come to learn and grow and better themselves. From the ashes of her auction, from the depths of her humiliation and fear, she had constructed something meaningful and lasting. Caleb appeared in the doorway as she was dismissing the evening class, waiting patiently while she answered final questions and said her goodnights. When the last student had ridden off into the darkness, he stepped inside and looked around the tidy room with obvious admiration. "You're amazing, you know that?" he said, without preamble. "What you've built here in just 2 months, it's extraordinary." Eleanor felt heat rise in her cheeks at the praise. "I'm just teaching. It's what I was trained to do." "It's more than that, and you know it. You're changing lives, Eleanor, giving people tools they'll use for the rest of their days. That cowboy who just left, Thomas McKay, I've worked alongside him for 3 years and never once heard him read aloud. Tonight I heard him working through that passage, slow but steady, and the pride on his face when he got through a difficult word." Caleb shook his head. "That's your doing. That's the gift you're giving people." Eleanor crossed to him, wrapping her arms around his waist and resting her cheek against his chest. "I couldn't do it without your support, without the Hendersons giving me space and resources, without the community trusting me enough to send their children and themselves. We're all better for having you here," Caleb said simply, his chin resting atop her head. "I'm better for having you in my life. Every single day I wake up grateful that I was in town that day, that I found the courage to step forward." "I'm grateful too," Eleanor murmured. "For all of it, even the hard parts, the scary parts. Because they led me here, to you, to this life." They stood there in the quiet schoolhouse for a long moment, holding each other and savoring the peace of being together. Outside, the October wind was picking up, carrying with it the first real chill of approaching winter. The drought still held the land in its grip, but there was talk of weather patterns changing, of storms building in the Pacific that might finally bring rain. Hope was beginning to creep back into people's voices when they talked about next year's planting, next year's calving season. "I have something to show you," Caleb said eventually, pulling back just far enough to meet her eyes. "Will you come with me? It's not far." Intrigued, Eleanor let him lead her back to the main house where he'd tied 2 horses, his bay gelding and a gentle mare that Eleanor had been learning to ride. They mounted up and headed north, away from the ranch buildings, following a path that Eleanor didn't recognize. The moon was waning, but still bright enough to see by, painting the landscape in shades of silver and shadow. After about 15 minutes of riding, Caleb guided them over a small rise and down into a shallow valley where a creek bed, mostly dry but showing signs of recent water flow, wound between low hills. And there, nestled in a natural clearing with good sight lines in all directions, and a grove of mesquite trees providing some shelter from the wind, was a half-built house. Eleanor's breath caught as Caleb helped her dismount and led her closer. It was modest but well constructed, the frame and walls already up, the roof about halfway complete. Even in the moonlight, she could see the care that had gone into the work, the straight lines, the solid joints, the attention to detail. "What is this?" she asked, though part of her already knew, already understood what she was seeing. "It's ours," Caleb said simply. "Our home, or it will be once it's finished. I've been working on it for the past 6 weeks, every spare moment I could steal. Mr. Henderson sold me this parcel at a price I could actually afford, said it was a wedding gift, though I'm still paying him for it, and some of the ranch hands have been helping when they have time." He took her hand, threading their fingers together. "I wanted to have a place that was ours, Eleanor. Not the bunkhouse, not a room in the Hendersons' house, but our own space where we can build our life together." Eleanor walked closer, her free hand trailing along the smooth wood of a window frame, imagining curtains there, imagining lamplight spilling out into the darkness. "How many rooms?" 4 plus the kitchen, 2 bedrooms to start, with space to add on when we need to. There'll be a good-sized main room with a fireplace, and I'm putting in extra windows so you'll have plenty of light for reading." He led her through what would be the front door, pointing out features in the skeletal structure. "Kitchen here, with a real iron stove. Not bought yet, but I've got money saved. Main room here, opening to the porch I'm planning for the front. Bedrooms in the back, situated to catch the morning sun." Eleanor could see it all, could picture their furniture arranged in the empty spaces, could imagine the sound of children playing, the smell of dinner cooking, the countless small moments that would accumulate into a life. "It's perfect," she whispered. "Caleb, it's absolutely perfect." "You really think so?" Because if you want changes, if you want things different, we can. She silenced him with a kiss, pouring all her love and gratitude and excitement into it. When she pulled back, both of them were breathing hard, their eyes locked in the silvery darkness. I don't want a single thing changed, Eleanor said firmly. It's exactly what I would have asked for if I had known to ask. How soon until it's finished? If the weather holds and I keep getting help from the hands, we should be able to move in by early December, in time for Christmas at least. I wanted you to be able to wake up in our own home on our wedding day. Eleanor felt tears prick at her eyes again. They seemed to come so easily these days, but they were good tears, happy tears, tears born of being so overwhelmed with blessing that her heart couldn't quite contain it all. Have I told you today that I love you? Not in the last 2 hours, Caleb replied with mock seriousness. I was starting to worry. I love you, Eleanor said, laughing through her tears. I love you so much that sometimes I can't believe this is real, that this is actually my life now. It's real, Caleb assured her, pulling her close and wrapping her in his arms. It's real, and it's ours, and it's just the beginning. They stayed at the building site for another hour, Eleanor asking questions about the construction while Caleb explained his plans and reasoning, adjusting details based on her preferences. She wanted deeper windowsills for plants, so he made a note to build them deeper. She suggested placing the kitchen window to face east to catch morning light while she made breakfast, and he agreed immediately. Together, they chose where the vegetable garden would go, where a chicken coop might sit, where someday there might be a barn for their own horses. The ride back to Silver Ridge felt different somehow, weighted with the knowledge of what they were building, of the concrete reality of their future taking shape board by board, nail by nail. Eleanor kept looking at Caleb's profile in the moonlight, at the strong lines of his face and the slight smile that seemed permanently settled at the corners of his mouth these days, and she felt a contentment so deep it was almost frightening in its intensity. The next morning dawned cold and gray, with clouds building on the horizon that made Mr. Henderson study the sky with cautious hope. Could be we're finally going to get some weather, he said over breakfast. Could be these clouds actually mean something for once. And that afternoon, as Eleanor was leading her students through a geography lesson, the first drops began to fall. One of the younger children noticed first, his eyes going wide as he pointed out the window. Miss Briggs, it's raining! Eleanor looked up and felt her heart leap. Rain, actual rain, the first substantial rainfall in over a year, falling in fat drops that quickly became a steady downpour. The children erupted in excitement, and Eleanor found herself laughing and crying at once as she gave in to their pleading and dismissed class early so they could run out and dance in the blessed wet. She stood in the schoolhouse doorway watching her students spin and shout in the rain, their faces tilted up to the sky, their clothes quickly soaking through. And then Caleb was there, appearing from wherever he'd been working, catching her around the waist and pulling her out into the downpour with him. It's raining, she shouted over the sound of water drumming on the roof, on the ground, on the baked earth that had waited so long for this relief. It's raining, Caleb agreed, spinning her around in a circle, both of them laughing like children. The drought is breaking, Eleanor. It's finally breaking. They stood there in the rain, soaked to the skin and grinning like fools, while around them the ranch erupted in celebration. Ranch hands appeared from barns and bunkhouses, faces turned skyward. Mrs. Henderson ran out of the main house without even grabbing a shawl, her arms spread wide as if to embrace the storm. Even Mr. Henderson emerged onto the porch, a rare broad smile on his weathered face as he watched the life-giving water soak into the parched earth. Eleanor looked at Caleb, at the rain running down his face and plastering his dark hair to his skull, at the pure joy in his expression, and felt something shift and settle in her chest. This moment, this perfect, impossible, wonderful moment, was hers. The rain was washing away the last lingering shadows of her past, cleansing the land and her spirit alike, offering renewal and hope and the promise of growth to come. Marry me, she said impulsively, though they were already engaged, though they'd already made this promise to each other. Caleb laughed, pulling her closer. I am marrying you. In 2 months, Christmas Day, remember? No, I mean, yes, but I mean, Eleanor struggled to articulate what she was feeling, this overwhelming sense of rightness and belonging and home. I mean, I choose you, Caleb Rourke, every day, in every way, with everything I am. I choose you. And I choose you, Caleb replied, his voice going serious despite the rain and the celebration and the chaos around them. Every day, in every way, with everything I am, today and always. They kissed in the rain while the drought broke, and the earth drank deep, and the future spread out before them like an unwritten page, full of possibility and promise, and the potential for more joy than Eleanor had ever imagined possible. 3 months ago, she had been auctioned for a sack of grain. Now, standing in the rain in the arms of the man she loved, surrounded by community and purpose, and the tangible evidence of the life she'd built from ruin, Eleanor understood that sometimes the darkest moments were just the necessary prelude to the brightest dawn. The rain continued through the evening and into the night, a steady, gentle soaking that the land desperately needed. Eleanor fell asleep that night in her room at the Hendersons' house, listening to the sound of water on the roof, Caleb's ring warm on her finger, her heart full of gratitude and love, and the quiet certainty that everything, every terrible moment, every frightening uncertainty, every hard-won victory had been leading her here, to this place, to this life, to this man who had seen her at her lowest and chosen to help her rise. The rain continued for 3 glorious days, transforming the landscape from brown desolation to something that almost remembered green. The creek beds filled, the cattle drank their fill, and everywhere Eleanor looked, she could see evidence of life returning to land that had nearly forgotten what abundance felt like. The change in the ranch's atmosphere was palpable. People smiled more easily, walked with lighter steps, spoke of the future with confidence rather than desperate hope. Eleanor's students were nearly impossible to wrangle that first week after the rain, their excitement manifesting in restless energy and constant distraction. She found herself adapting her lessons, taking them outside when the weather permitted to study the emerging plant life, to practice their writing by describing the changes they observed, to calculate water volume in the creek using mathematics that suddenly felt relevant and real rather than abstract. "You're a natural at this, Mrs. Henderson observed one afternoon, watching through the window as Eleanor led her students in a nature walk, their voices carrying back to the house in excited chatter. Making learning feel like discovery rather than drudgery. Those children are lucky to have you." "I'm lucky to have them," Eleanor replied, coming in from the cold with flushed cheeks and wind-blown hair. "Every day they remind me why I chose teaching in the first place. The way their faces light up when they finally understand something they've been struggling with. There's no feeling quite like it." The weeks between the rain's arrival and Christmas passed in a blur of preparation and anticipation. Caleb worked every available moment on their house, and true to his word, by the first week of December, it was finished enough to be livable. The roof was complete, the windows installed, the floors sanded smooth. There was still work to be done, painting, final trim, building furniture, but the structure itself was sound and ready. Eleanor visited whenever she could, bringing measurements and ideas, imagining where everything would go. Mrs. Henderson had gifted them her mother's old dishes, carefully wrapped and stored for years, and several ranch families had contributed furniture they could spare. A rocking chair here, a small table there, bits and pieces that together would make a home. One cold December afternoon, Eleanor stood in what would be their bedroom, looking out the window at the view of distant hills and closer trees, and felt Caleb's arms come around her from behind. "What are you thinking?" he asked, his chin resting on top of her head. "I'm thinking about waking up here," Eleanor said softly. "About seeing this view every morning. About making coffee in our kitchen and sitting at our table and building our life in these rooms. I'm thinking about how impossible this would have seemed 4 months ago and how inevitable it feels now." "Inevitable," Caleb repeated, testing the word. "I like that. Like we were always meant to end up here, together, building this." "Weren't we?" Eleanor turned in his arms to face him. "I don't believe in fate exactly, but I believe in grace. I believe that sometimes terrible things happen, and sometimes they lead to beautiful things, and the beautiful things don't justify the terrible ones, but they redeem them somehow, make them bearable in retrospect." Caleb's expression grew serious, one hand coming up to cup her face. "Do you ever regret it?" Not the outcome, but having to go through what you went through to get here. Eleanor considered this carefully, knowing he deserved an honest answer. I regret that Dunley's cruelty exists in the world. I regret that circumstances forced me into a position where I was vulnerable to it. But do I regret the journey that led me to you, to this community, to the life I'm building? No. I wouldn't change it, because changing it might mean losing this, and I'm not willing to risk that. Even the auction, the ropes, the fear? Even those things, Eleanor confirmed, because they taught me things about myself I needed to learn, about my own strength, about my capacity to survive and rebuild, about the difference between existing and living. She pressed her palm flat against his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart. And they led me to you, which makes them worthwhile in the end. They stood there in their unfinished bedroom as the winter sun slanted through the window, painting everything in shades of gold, and Eleanor felt peace settle over her like a warm blanket. This was where she belonged. This man, this place, this life they were building together. This was home in a way she'd never quite experienced before. As Christmas approached, the ranch transformed into something magical. Mrs. Henderson threw herself into preparations with the enthusiasm of someone who'd been waiting years for the opportunity to plan a wedding. Evergreen boughs appeared on every surface, filling the house with their sharp, clean scent. The main room was cleared and cleaned until it sparkled, chairs borrowed from neighbors and arranged in careful rows. A small platform was built at one end where Eleanor and Caleb would stand to exchange their vows. Caleb's family arrived 3 days before Christmas. His parents, stern-faced but kind-eyed, and his 3 sisters with their husbands and a passel of children who immediately bonded with Eleanor's students during an impromptu school visit. His mother, Sarah, took Eleanor's hands in hers the moment they were introduced and studied her face with an intensity that might have been intimidating if not for the warmth underlying it. "So you're the woman who captured my boy's heart," Sarah said, her voice carrying the hint of an accent from her German ancestry. "He wrote that you were special, but I needed to see for myself." "And?" Eleanor asked, fighting nervousness. Sarah smiled, the expression transforming her stern features into something beautiful. "And he was right. You are special. I can see it in your eyes, strength and kindness in equal measure. That's rare. That's precious." She pulled Eleanor into a hug that smelled of lavender and bread. "Welcome to our family, daughter. We're glad to have you." The acceptance brought tears to Eleanor's eyes, reminding her of what she'd lost when her own family died, and what she was gaining through this marriage. Not just a husband, but a whole network of people who would become hers, who would support and challenge and love her. The night before the wedding, Eleanor lay awake in her room at the Hendersons' house for the last time, too excited and nervous to sleep. Tomorrow she would become Eleanor Rourke. Tomorrow she would move into the house Caleb had built with his own hands. Tomorrow her life would change in ways both profound and subtle, and the anticipation of it thrummed through her veins like electricity. A soft knock on her door interrupted her restless thoughts. "Come in," she called, expecting Mrs. Henderson. Instead, Caleb slipped inside, closing the door quietly behind him. "I know it's bad luck for the groom to see the bride before the wedding, but that's on the day itself, and technically it's still the night before. So I'm claiming a loophole." Eleanor sat up, pulling the quilt around her shoulders against the chill. "What are you doing here?" "I couldn't sleep," Caleb admitted, crossing to sit on the edge of her bed, careful to maintain a respectful distance. "Kept thinking about tomorrow, about everything that's about to change, and I realized I needed to see you, to make sure you were real, that this was really happening." "I'm real," Eleanor assured him, reaching out to take his hand. "And tomorrow is really happening. Are you having second thoughts?" "God, no. Opposite of second thoughts. I'm having about 100th thoughts, all of them variations of how did I get this lucky, and how long until I can call her my wife." He squeezed her hand gently. "But I also wanted to give you one more chance to back out if you needed it. No judgment, no hard feelings. I'd understand if—" "Caleb." Eleanor shifted closer, still wrapped in her quilt. "I'm not backing out. I'm not having second thoughts. I'm counting the hours until I can stand up in front of everyone we care about and promise to love you for the rest of my life. So unless you're the one having doubts—" "No doubts," he interrupted firmly. "Not a single one. I just wanted to hear you say it one more time before tomorrow makes it official." They sat together in the quiet darkness, hands linked, drawing comfort from each other's presence. Eventually, Caleb spoke again, his voice soft and wondering. "Do you remember that first day when I brought you here? You asked me why I was helping you, and I said because no decent man could stand there and do nothing. I remember. I thought I was just doing the right thing, making up for past mistakes, being the person I wished I'd been 3 years ago in that town in New Mexico." He turned to look at her, his eyes reflecting the moonlight streaming through her window. "But Eleanor, bringing you here was the most selfish thing I've ever done, because I got to meet you. I got to know you, to watch you heal and grow and become even more remarkable than you already were. I got to fall in love with you." So maybe it looked like pure altruism from the outside, but really, I've been the one receiving the gift all along. Eleanor felt her throat tighten with emotion. "We gave each other gifts," she said. "You gave me freedom and safety. I gave you the chance to be the man you wanted to be, and together we built something neither of us could have built alone." Caleb leaned forward and kissed her forehead, gentle and reverent. "Tomorrow," he whispered. "Tomorrow we make it official." "Tomorrow," Eleanor agreed. He left as quietly as he'd come, and Eleanor lay back down with a smile on her face and peace in her heart. Tomorrow couldn't come fast enough. Christmas morning dawned clear and cold, the sky a brilliant blue, unmarred by clouds. Eleanor woke to Mrs. Henderson bustling into her room with breakfast and barely contained excitement. "Wedding day," the older woman announced, setting down a tray with eggs and toast and coffee. "How are you feeling? Nervous? Excited? Ready to become Mrs. Caleb Rourke?" "All of the above," Eleanor admitted, sitting up and accepting the coffee gratefully. "Mostly excited, though, and grateful. So incredibly grateful." The morning passed in a flurry of preparation. Mrs. Henderson had indeed commissioned a proper wedding dress, and when Eleanor finally saw it, she gasped. It was simple but beautiful. White cotton with delicate lace at the collar and cuffs, fitted at the waist and flowing to the floor in soft folds. The seamstress had embroidered tiny blue bonnets along the hem, a nod to Texas and to the valley where Caleb had proposed. "Mrs. Henderson, it's too much," Eleanor protested, even as her fingers traced the delicate embroidery. "You've already done so much. Hush. Every bride deserves a proper dress, and you're going to look beautiful in it, Mrs." Henderson's eyes were suspiciously bright as she helped Eleanor into the gown, fastening the many small buttons up the back. "There. Now let's do something with that hair of yours." Sarah Rourke appeared to help, and together the two older women styled Eleanor's copper hair into an elegant arrangement, leaving a few curls loose to frame her face. They tucked fresh holly berries into the style, adding a festive touch that caught the light when Eleanor moved. When they finally let her look in the mirror, Eleanor barely recognized herself. The woman staring back was radiant, confident, beautiful, not because of the dress or the hair, though both were lovely, but because of the joy and certainty shining from her eyes. This was a woman who knew what she wanted and was about to claim it. This was a woman who had survived the worst and emerged ready to embrace the best. "You look like happiness itself," Mrs. Henderson said, her voice thick with emotion. "Caleb is going to lose his ability to speak when he sees you." Downstairs, the house had filled with guests, ranch families and neighbors, Caleb's relatives, Eleanor's students and their parents. Even the ranch hands cleaned up in their Sunday best. Someone was playing fiddle, filling the air with cheerful music, and the smell of Mrs. Henderson's cooking wafted from the kitchen where Christmas dinner was already well underway. Mr. Henderson appeared at the foot of the stairs, resplendent in a suit that looked uncomfortable but was worn with dignity. When he saw Eleanor descending, his weathered face broke into a broad smile. "You look beautiful, daughter," he said, offering his arm. "Caleb asked me to stand in for your father today if you're willing. It would be my honor to give you away." Eleanor had to blink back tears at the gesture. "The honor would be mine," she managed. The music shifted as they approached the main room, becoming the wedding march played with somewhat imperfect but deeply heartfelt enthusiasm. The crowd fell silent and turned to watch as Eleanor appeared in the doorway on Mr. Henderson's arm. But Eleanor only had eyes for Caleb, standing at the front of the room beside the minister they'd brought in from the next town over. He was wearing a new suit, black and formal, making him look both familiar and new at once, and his hair was neatly combed for possibly the first time since she'd known him. But it was his expression that stole her breath, pure, undiluted love and wonder, like he was witnessing a miracle and couldn't quite believe his luck. The walk down the makeshift aisle seemed to take both forever and no time at all. And then Mr. Henderson was placing her hand in Caleb's, was stepping back with a nod of approval, and suddenly it was just the two of them standing before the minister while everyone they cared about watched and waited. The ceremony itself passed in a blur of words and responses, traditional vows spoken with untraditional fervor. Eleanor heard herself promise to love and honor and cherish, heard Caleb make the same promises back to her, but mostly she was aware of his hands holding hers, steady and sure, and his eyes never leaving her face, drinking in every detail, as if committing this moment to permanent memory. And then the minister was saying, "I now pronounce you husband and wife." And Caleb was kissing her, their first kiss as a married couple, and the room erupted in applause and cheers that seemed to shake the rafters. "Mrs. Rourke," Caleb whispered against her lips, testing out the name. "Eleanor Rourke." "I like the sound of that," Eleanor whispered back, smiling so wide her cheeks hurt. The celebration that followed was everything Eleanor could have hoped for and more. There was music and dancing, with Caleb's father producing a harmonica to accompany the fiddle player, and even the children joining in the reels and jigs that had everyone breathless and laughing. There was food in abundance, roasted turkey and ham, vegetables and breads, pies and cakes, and Mrs. Henderson's famous cookies. There were toasts and speeches, some eloquent and others charmingly awkward, but all sincere in their wishes for the newlyweds' happiness. Eleanor danced with Caleb, with Mr. Henderson, with each of Caleb's brothers-in-law, with some of her older students who were learning the steps. She accepted congratulations and well wishes from what felt like everyone in the county, her cheeks aching from smiling, her heart so full she thought it might burst. As the afternoon wore into evening and guests began to depart, Eleanor found herself standing at the window watching families load into wagons and ride off into the gathering dusk. Caleb came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist and resting his chin on her shoulder. "Ready to go home, Mrs. Rourke?" "So ready," Eleanor breathed, "though I hate to leave Mrs. Henderson with all the cleanup." "Already handled," Mrs. Henderson called from across the room, shooing them with both hands. "I've got plenty of help. You two go on to your new home. Go start your life together." They didn't need to be told twice. After final hugs and thanks, Eleanor changed into a simple traveling dress while Caleb hitched up a small wagon loaded with their belongings and wedding gifts. The ride to their new house took only 20 minutes, but it felt significant somehow. This journey from the Henderson Ranch to the home they would share, from wedding celebration to married life. The house looked beautiful in the twilight, lamplight already glowing from inside thanks to ranch hands who'd gone ahead to light fires in the hearth and the stove to make sure everything was ready for the newlyweds' arrival. Caleb pulled the wagon to a stop and turned to Eleanor with a grin. "I believe there's a tradition about carrying the bride across the threshold." "I believe you're right," Eleanor agreed, laughing as Caleb swept her up into his arms with surprising ease. He carried her through the door and into their home, setting her down gently in the main room. The space glowed with firelight and lamplight, casting dancing shadows on walls that were still bare but wouldn't be for long. Their few pieces of furniture were arranged thoughtfully, the rocking chair by the hearth, the small sofa gifted by Caleb's parents positioned to face the fireplace, the table and chairs in the kitchen area. It was simple and spare and absolutely perfect. "Welcome home, Eleanor," Caleb said softly, taking both her hands in his. "Welcome home, husband," Eleanor replied, the word foreign and wonderful on her tongue. They spent their first evening as a married couple exploring their space, rearranging a few pieces of furniture, discussing where things would eventually go. They ate a simple supper of bread and cheese and cold chicken left by Mrs. Henderson, feeding each other bites and stealing kisses between, giddy with the freedom of finally being alone together as husband and wife. Later, lying in their new bed in their new bedroom with Caleb's arms around her and the sound of wind in the trees outside, Eleanor reflected on the improbable journey that had brought her to this moment. From that terrible day in Dust Creek to this perfect night in their own home, the distance seemed impossible to measure in mere months or miles. It felt like lifetimes, like she'd lived several different lives in the span of a single season. "What are you thinking?" Caleb asked, his voice rumbling through his chest where her cheek rested. "I'm thinking about how much has changed," Eleanor said. "About who I was and who I am now. About the difference between surviving and thriving, and how you showed me the path from one to the other." "You showed yourself that path," Caleb corrected gently. "I just opened a door. You're the one who walked through it and built something beautiful on the other side." Eleanor lifted her head to look at him in the moonlight streaming through their window. "We built it together. That's what makes it beautiful. Not the house or the school or any of the external things, but the fact that we chose to build them together. That we chose each other." Caleb pulled her closer, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "Best choice I ever made." "Best choice we both made," Eleanor murmured, settling back against him with a contented sigh. The weeks and months that followed their wedding settled into a rhythm that felt both comfortable and exciting. Eleanor continued teaching, her student roster growing as word spread about the quality of education available at the Silver Ridge School. Caleb worked the ranch and their small parcel of land, beginning to build a herd of their own with cattle bought using his savings. Together, they made their house into a home, adding touches of personality and comfort with each passing week. The rain that had broken the drought continued sporadically through the winter and into spring, transforming the landscape with dramatic swiftness. Grass returned to the pastures, wildflowers bloomed in impossible profusion, and the creek that ran near their property flowed with clear, cold water that seemed like a miracle after the long dry spell. Eleanor's students thrived under her continued instruction, and several families began talking about pooling resources to build a proper schoolhouse in a more central location, with Eleanor as the permanent teacher. The evening adult education classes grew until she had to split them into two groups, one for beginners and one for those who'd progressed beyond basic literacy. And through it all, Eleanor and Caleb grew together, learning each other's rhythms and habits, weathering small disagreements, and celebrating small victories, building the foundation of a marriage that would sustain them through whatever the future held. One evening in late March, Eleanor was washing dishes after supper when she felt Caleb's arms come around her from behind, his hands resting on her stomach in a way that had become familiar and dear. "I have something to tell you," she said, setting down the plate she'd been washing and turning in his arms to face him. Caleb's expression grew attentive, reading something in her face that made his eyes widen with cautious hope. "What is it?" Eleanor took his hand and placed it palm flat against her stomach, holding it there while she watched understanding dawn across his features. "We're having a baby. I'm about 2 months along as best I can figure." For a moment, Caleb simply stared at her, his expression cycling through shock, joy, disbelief, and back to joy. Then he was lifting her up, spinning her around, laughing and crying at the same time. "A baby," he kept repeating like he couldn't quite believe it. "We're having a baby. Eleanor, we're going to be parents." "We are," Eleanor confirmed, her own eyes wet with happy tears. "Sometime around early October, if my calculations are right." Caleb set her down carefully, as if she'd suddenly become fragile, and Eleanor laughed at the concern on his face. "I'm pregnant, not made of glass. You don't have to treat me like I'll break." "I know, He shook his head, still looking dazed. "This is the best news. The absolute best news." His hands moved to frame her face, his thumbs brushing across her cheekbones. "You're going to be an amazing mother." "And you're going to be an amazing father," Eleanor replied. "I've seen you with your nieces and nephews, with my students. You're patient and kind, and you actually listen to children instead of just talking at them. Our baby is so lucky to have you as a father." They stood there in their kitchen, holding each other and contemplating the new life growing between them, the next chapter in their story beginning to write itself. Eleanor thought about the child she was carrying, about the future spreading out before them like an unrolled map showing territories yet unexplored. "From a sack of grain to a family of our own," Caleb said wonderingly. "When I stepped forward that day in Dust Creek, I never imagined it would lead to this." "Neither did I," Eleanor admitted, "but I'm so grateful it did. Every hard moment, every scary uncertainty, every tear and fear, they all led here, to this life we're building, to this family we're creating." The pregnancy progressed smoothly through the spring and into summer. Eleanor continued teaching through May before reluctantly closing the school for the season, promising students and parents alike that classes would resume in September after the baby was born. Several of her students presented her with small gifts on the last day: drawings and pressed flowers, a beautiful quilt pieced together by the mothers, a cradle built by some of the fathers and older brothers with wood left over from barn repairs. The generosity and care demonstrated by her community never failed to move Eleanor to tears, though Caleb teasingly blamed that on her delicate condition rather than genuine emotion. She swatted at him but couldn't deny that pregnancy had made her more prone to tears, both happy and sad, though mostly happy these days. As her belly grew round with their child, Caleb became increasingly protective and attentive, building a cradle that matched the design of the gifted one, so they'd have one in each bedroom, sewing tiny clothes with clumsy but determined stitches, reading every book about pregnancy and childbirth he could get his hands on, until Eleanor finally told him to stop before he worried himself sick. Mrs. Henderson, predictably, was beside herself with excitement about the coming baby. She'd never had children of her own, a sorrow she rarely spoke of but carried quietly. And she threw herself into preparing for Eleanor's baby with the enthusiasm of a grandmother-in-waiting. She showed Eleanor how to swaddle and burp, shared recipes for foods that would help with milk production, and promised to be there for the birth to help however needed. Sarah Rourke visited for 2 weeks in August, bringing with her the combined wisdom of 3 births and countless grandchildren. She and Eleanor spent hours talking about motherhood and marriage, about the challenges and joys that lay ahead, and Eleanor felt herself growing more confident in her ability to handle what was coming. "You're stronger than you think," Sarah told her one afternoon as they sat on the porch shelling peas, Eleanor's hands resting on her swollen belly where the baby kicked and squirmed. "I can see it in you, that core of steel wrapped in softness. That's what motherhood needs. Strength enough to protect and guide, but gentleness enough not to break their spirits in the process." "I'm terrified I'll mess it up," Eleanor admitted. "What if I'm not good enough? What if I don't know what to do?" "Then you'll figure it out, just like every mother before you has figured it out." Sarah reached over to pat Eleanor's hand. "Love covers a multitude of mistakes. You love this baby already. I can see it in the way you touch your belly, in the way you talk about the future. That love will guide you through the hard moments and make the beautiful moments even sweeter." The baby came on a cool October evening, 3 weeks after Eleanor had closed the schoolhouse for the day, and 2 weeks after she'd started feeling the occasional contractions that Mrs. Henderson assured her were normal. Caleb had been working on the fence line when Eleanor's water broke, and by the time he made it back to the house at Mrs. Henderson's urgent summons, Eleanor was deep into labor, gripping the bedpost and breathing through contractions that seemed to be coming faster and harder with each passing hour. The birth was long and difficult, lasting through the night and into the early morning hours. Caleb stayed by Eleanor's side the entire time, letting her squeeze his hand until he lost feeling in his fingers, offering water and encouragement and love when she felt like she couldn't go on. Mrs. Henderson proved her worth as a midwife, calm and competent, guiding Eleanor through each stage with patient instruction. And finally, as the sun was breaking over the horizon and painting their bedroom in shades of pink and gold, their daughter entered the world with a furious cry that seemed far too loud for someone so small. "You did it," Caleb breathed, his voice thick with emotion as Mrs. Henderson cleaned and swaddled the baby before placing her in Eleanor's arms. "Eleanor, you did it. She's perfect." Eleanor looked down at the tiny face, red and wrinkled and absolutely beautiful, and felt her heart expand in ways she hadn't known were possible. This was her daughter, hers and Caleb's. A perfect blend of both of them, with a shock of dark hair and eyes that would probably be blue like her father's. "Hello, little one," Eleanor whispered, stroking one finger down the baby's impossibly soft cheek. "Welcome to the world. We've been waiting for you." They named her Grace Catherine Rourke, Grace for the undeserved blessing that had brought them together, Catherine after Eleanor's mother. From the first moment, she was the center of their universe, tiny and demanding and absolutely adored. Caleb proved to be exactly the father Eleanor had known he would be, patient and gentle, changing diapers without complaint, walking the floor at 3 a.m. when Grace was fussy, singing silly songs that made Eleanor laugh even in the midst of exhaustion. He looked at their daughter with the same wonder and love he'd shown Eleanor from the beginning, And watching him hold Grace, watching the tenderness in his face and the careful way he supported her tiny head, Eleanor felt her love for him deepen in ways she hadn't thought possible. The months after Grace's birth were a blur of sleepless nights and overwhelming love, of learning to be parents together, of discovering new depths to their partnership as they navigated this new phase of life. Mrs. Henderson visited often, giving Eleanor breaks to rest or bathe, teaching her tricks for soothing a colicky baby or encouraging better sleep patterns. Eleanor reopened the school in January, bringing Grace with her since she was still nursing. To her surprise and deep satisfaction, the students, especially the girls, were fascinated by the baby, asking endless questions about infant care that Eleanor incorporated into lessons about child development, nutrition, and basic health care. It became an unexpected teaching tool, making abstract concepts concrete through the presence of one very real, very demanding infant. By the time spring arrived again, bringing with it the anniversary of Eleanor's first year in Texas, the transformation in her life was complete and unmistakable. She stood in her schoolhouse one April afternoon, Grace asleep in a basket near her desk while her students bent over their slates, and felt a sense of rightness and belonging so profound it brought tears to her eyes. 1 year ago, she'd been broken and afraid, standing with bound wrists in a dusty street, her future stolen. Now she was Eleanor Rourke, wife, mother, teacher, beloved member of a community that valued and respected her. She had a home built by her husband's hands, a daughter sleeping peacefully nearby, students whose lives she was shaping for the better, and a future that stretched out before her filled with possibility and promise. That evening, after the students had gone and she'd locked the schoolhouse door, Eleanor carried Grace back to their home to find Caleb already there, having finished his work early. He'd started dinner, simple but edible, and had flowers on the table, wildflowers picked from the meadow behind their house. "What's the occasion?" Eleanor asked, settling Grace in her cradle before moving to embrace her husband. 1 year, Caleb said simply. 1 year ago today, I brought you here to Silver Ridge for the first time. 1 year ago, your new life began. I wanted to mark it. Eleanor felt her throat tighten with emotion. She'd been so focused on daily survival and then daily joy that she'd lost track of the specific date. But Caleb had remembered. He'd marked this anniversary of her rescue, her transformation, her rebirth into the person she was always meant to be. "Thank you," she whispered against his chest, "for remembering, for everything, for stepping forward when no one else would, for giving me freedom and safety and love, for building this life with me." "Thank you," Caleb countered, "for choosing to stay, for choosing me, for being brave enough to heal and strong enough to build something beautiful from the ashes, for giving me grace, for making me a father, for showing me what real partnership looks like." They stood there in their kitchen holding each other while their daughter slept and dinner cooled on the table, and Eleanor thought about journeys and destinations, about the winding path that had brought her from Missouri to Texas, from despair to hope, from bondage to freedom. She thought about the girl she'd been standing in that square, bound and afraid, and the woman she'd become, confident and capable, loved and valued, with purpose and family and a future she'd built with her own hands and heart. She thought about Caleb, about the man who'd seen injustice and refused to look away, who'd offered her freedom without strings and then offered her love without conditions, who'd become her partner in every sense of the word. And she thought about Grace, sleeping peacefully in her cradle, unaware that her very existence was proof of redemption and grace, evidence that even the darkest moments could give birth to the most beautiful outcomes. "From a sack of grain to a lifetime of love," Eleanor murmured, echoing Caleb's words from so long ago. "Who would have thought?" "Anyone who knows you," Caleb replied with conviction. "Anyone who sees your strength, your resilience, your capacity for love and forgiveness and growth. You are always going to end up here, Eleanor. Maybe not with me, maybe not in this exact place, but somewhere building something meaningful. Because that's who you are at your core." Eleanor pulled back to look at him, at this man who had become her everything, her partner and lover and friend and co-parent. "I think we were always going to end up here together," she said. "I don't believe in fate, but I believe in grace. And grace brought us together that day in Dust Creek. Grace gave me the courage to heal, gave you the courage to step forward, gave us both the wisdom to recognize what we could build together. The sun was setting outside their window, painting the Texas sky in brilliant shades of orange and crimson and gold. In the distance, Eleanor could see the lights of Silver Ridge Ranch, could see the outline of her schoolhouse, could see the land spreading out in all directions, land that had nearly died from drought, but had been redeemed by rain, just as she had been redeemed by kindness and love. She was Eleanor Rourke, wife and mother and teacher. She was a woman who had survived being auctioned for a sack of grain and had transformed that degradation into dignity, that loss into gain, that ending into a beginning more beautiful than she could have imagined. And standing in her home with her husband's arms around her and her daughter sleeping nearby, with friends who were family and students who needed her and a future stretching out before them all. Like an unwritten book full of blank pages waiting to be filled, Eleanor understood that sometimes the best stories were the ones that began with darkness and ended with light, that started with goodbye and ended with hello, that transformed pain into purpose and fear into love. Her story had begun in desperate circumstances, but it had become something precious and rare, a testament to resilience and hope, to the power of one person's choice to step forward when others stepped back, to the grace that could transform even the most broken situations into something whole and beautiful. From a sack of grain to a life of gold, from bound wrists to open hands, from auction block to marriage bed, from despair to joy, from ending to beginning. This was Eleanor's story. This was their story, hers and Caleb's and Grace's, and the children yet to come, the students yet to teach, the years yet to live. And it was, in every possible way, a story worth telling.